The story begins with our heroine realizing she has been reincarnated into this world at the age of 8. It happened at a tea party held in the Imperial Palace. When she opened her eyes to a blue sky and a fairy tale-like garden, she saw people in lavish attire and a girl with sky blue hair. While wandering in the garden, a voice called her Espin Samuel, warning her not to run off. At that moment, the red-eyed girl was utterly shocked to hear that name. She knew she had been Kim Soyeon and wondered in confusion why they were calling her Espin and if she was in a dream. To be sure, she pinched her cheek hard and felt the pain, confirming it wasn't just a dream. She clearly remembered sleeping in her own bed the previous night, which made her even more confused about what was happening. She sat on a swing, trying to calm herself down and think logically. She wondered if it was a lucid dream or if she had unknowingly entered a virtual reality game, especially since she couldn't remember anything. Her thoughts were interrupted by whispers nearby, with someone asking if they were doing that again. She decided to hide and eavesdrop, hoping to understand what was going on around her. The conversation was between several court ladies and was about finding a playmate for Prince Luciano, a name that seemed familiar to Espin. One of them sarcastically remarked that everyone knew the true purpose of the tea party and criticized Empress Isabel's actions. Her companion quickly warned her to lower her voice, reminding her they were in the Imperial Palace, so the lady apologized in fear. They wondered who would volunteer to be the prince's companion and mentioned that the family of Marquis Simon was desperate for any connection to the royal family, insisting their eldest daughter, Brianna, could become a mage, even though Prince Stephen would never choose her. Hearing the names Luciano, Brianna, and Stephen, Espin began to connect the events to a novel she had read before. She recalled the novel's title, Your Majesty, Please Don't Be Obsessed, and the details about the Simon family, a family that had once produced great mages, but whose magical bloodline had been severed. The original heroine, Brianna, approached the male lead with the goal of reviving her declining family. And that male lead was none other than the Grand Prince and main heir to the throne, Luciano Frederick. Luciano's life was filled with constant threats from Empress Isabel and the second prince, Stephen, especially after losing his mother at a young age. Brianna needed power to restore her family's honor, while Luciano desperately needed forces to support him. Thus, the two united out of necessity, and after a series of events, they fell in love, leading the story down the typical path expected in a novel. Suddenly, the girl realized the castle before her perfectly matched the description in the novel, confirming to her that this was not a dream and she was indeed in the world of the novel. She quickly deduced that this was a case of reincarnation into another body. She remembered they had called her Espin earlier, but she had never seen that name in the original novel, which meant Espin was just an insignificant extra. However, based on her long experience reading romance fantasy novels, being reincarnated into the body of a nobody meant only one thing. She had become the novel's new heroine. She snapped her fingers confidently, convinced this was the classic reincarnation trope. She briefly wondered what happened to the original owner, but decided to enjoy this new opportunity and live a life paved with gold by relying on the heroine's privilege. She began to think about the male leads associated with the heroine. First, the original male lead, Luciano Frederick. Then there was the second male lead, Harrison Olindo, and the hidden villain, Damien Quaid, and she wondered which of them would be the hero of her story. Her thoughts were interrupted by the entrance of the Empress and the Prince, and she was surprised by how quickly events were unfolding. She watched the scene from her hiding spot, deducing from their appearance that this was the childhood phase before the main story began. With his pale skin, bright golden hair, and red eyes, she immediately recognized Luciano. Observing his features up close, she realized he was even more beautiful than described, and he was the male lead of the original story. She felt sympathy for him. Although he would become paranoid and obsessive in the future, he looked truly pitiful in his childhood. Espin realized this tea party was nothing but a scheme orchestrated by Empress Isabel to humiliate Luciano and pave the way for her son to ascend the throne. The Empress arrived with Prince Stephen, hypocritically asking if they were late. She thanked the attendees with a cunning smile and invited them to take their seats freely. She always claimed these spring tea parties were meant to foster friendship, but everyone knew the truth of her real intentions. Empress Isabel watched the table where her son, Prince Stephen, sat surrounded by people, and then made sure Luciano was sitting all alone at the opposite table, just as it happened in the original novel. Espin watched the scene indignantly, realizing the Empress was blatantly isolating him, and described the Empress's behavior as very childish. The Empress walked towards Luciano. She asked him with veiled sarcasm if he was alone again this year, and Luciano calmly gave an affirmative answer. The Empress feigned sympathy, saying his social skills were so poor that she had to intervene. Espin remembered this scene clearly, even though it was just a side story in the novel. The Empress raised her voice to the attendees, asking if anyone was willing to befriend Prince Luciano, claiming she was worried he would be hurt at these gatherings. Silence and hesitation filled the audience, and so the search for a playmate for Prince Luciano began. The whole venue was silent, with everyone frozen in their seats, holding their breath for Empress Isabel's reaction. That moment was enough to remind Luciano once again of the painful truth. He was completely alone in this world. Meanwhile, Espin watched the scene, angrily wondering how they could just sit there motionlessly, even though she had foreseen this would happen. She couldn't stand the situation any longer. Suddenly, a small voice rang out, announcing its willingness to step forward, breaking the silence. Espin jumped up from her seat and enthusiastically raised her hand, declaring she would be the prince's friend. She justified her impulsive action by saying that sunny heroines are usually spontaneous and oblivious to tense atmospheres. She stood boldly before them and, with a brilliant smile, told Prince Luciano she would be his friend, which made the prince mutter in surprise while the Empress shot her a cold glare. The Empress masked the situation with a false smile, thanked her for the offer, and asked for the brave girl's name in a gentle tone. Espin lifted her skirt, curtsied respectfully, and introduced herself as Espin from the house of Count Samuel, expressing her honor in meeting them. The attendees began to whisper in admiration, praising the Count's upbringing of his daughter and her good performance, although everyone had chosen silence. Espin's bold move forced the Empress to comment that she was a kind-hearted and warm girl, while hiding her true annoyance behind her fan. Espin was confused for a moment, wondering if she should have remained silent, observed the atmosphere, and thought about how to apologize for her rashness. But when the Empress expressed her gratitude, she quickly regained her confidence and decided to continue playing the role of the sunny heroine, smiling innocently. The two exchanged glances, a challenge hidden beneath masks of cordiality and smiles. The Empress calmly asked Espin what drove her to want to be his friend and maliciously posed a loaded question to Espin, asking if her motive was pity. Espin was shocked by the way the question was asked, which made things seem strange and aggressive, and she looked anxiously at Luciano, hoping he wouldn't take it seriously. Espin noticed a look of suspicion starting to appear in Luciano's eyes, and, realizing the Empress was trying to manipulate and isolate him, she mentally shouted at him not to fall into the trap of the woman who tormented him. She clenched her fists nervously, deciding she had no choice but to resort to the shy child trick to get out of the predicament. She pretended not to understand, innocently asking what pity meant and if one really needed a reason to be friends with someone. The Empress seemed annoyed and cornered by Espin's persistence, while Espin continued to skillfully play her role. Espin showed great surprise at the Empress's question, feigning confusion as if she didn't understand the malice within it, while inwardly celebrating the success of her plan. Espin reminded the Empress that just a moment ago, she had been worried the prince would be lonely forever. Espin continued her soft attack, pointing out that the Empress's use of the word insist made it seem as if she were uncomfortable with the idea of the prince having a friend. She added with childlike seriousness that she had learned about harmony and the necessity of being kind to everyone. She looked around at the people present and asked, "Isn't that how it should be?" causing everyone to murmur in agreement. The Empress tried to back down and nervously defend her position, saying Espin had misunderstood, but Espin gave her no chance to make excuses and decided to take the next step. False tears welled up in her eyes, and she asked in a trembling voice if the Empress disliked her, prompting the Empress to deny it. Soon, the attendees began to whisper, discussing the Empress's cruelty towards an innocent little girl and how she was against the prince making a friend just because the girl was a count's daughter. The Empress was forced to save face, denying any objection and confirming with a nervous laugh that Espin had no flaws, claiming she was just worried the introverted prince might feel overwhelmed. Espin immediately seized the opportunity, wiped her tears, and announced with a brilliant and triumphant smile that as long as Her Majesty the Empress didn't mind, she would like to become His Highness the Prince's friend starting today. Empress Isabel finally agreed, leaving the prince in Espin's care, but her gaze held hidden surprise as the little girl hadn't cried as expected, while Espin was already planning to do things her own way. Suddenly, she called out loudly to Prince Luciano, who was sitting alone at his table. Espin walked confidently towards him and introduced herself as Espin Samuel. With a vibrant and brilliant smile, she suggested they become friends starting today, while proudly telling herself that her splendid performance perfectly matched the behavior of a heroine. That evening at the Samuel family residence, Espin faced reprimands for her reckless behavior at the tea party. Her parents, Count Benjamin and his wife Lily, stood before her with shocked expressions, surprised that she had dared to address the Empress in such an abrupt manner. Espin looked at them, realizing deep down that these two were her parents. From now on, she recalled the moment she realized she had come to this world, as the memories of the original Espin up to the age of 8 flooded her mind, and she felt immense happiness due to the warmth and tenderness these parents had given their daughter. Her father asked her seriously and anxiously if she really wanted to be friends with Prince Luciano, and seeing her father's worried expression, Espin felt uneasy, wondering if the original Espin's feelings were still affecting her. She remembered the Empress's terrifying aura and felt regret, worrying that her haste and focus on Luciano might bring harm to her family. She explained her position to her parents in a faint voice, explaining that she couldn't bear to watch the prince in such a sad situation. Then she lowered her head and apologized for her personal actions, wringing her hands nervously. The silence lasted for a moment, and Espin thought she was about to receive a severe scolding. But to her surprise, her father gently patted her head, explaining that their questions were not a reprimand, but out of concern that she might face difficulties. He smiled at her, affirming that it was admirable to think of others and put them before herself, and encouraged her to follow her heart. Her parents confirmed their full support for her, telling her to enjoy her time with the prince and to come to them anytime she needed help. This made Espin realize that although they were clearly worried about Empress Isabel, they valued her choices and happiness more. With the assurance that they would always be on her side, tears began to well up in Espin's eyes. She wondered in amazement what this unconditional love was, and if she, not being the real Espin, truly deserved to receive all this warmth. She wished she could stay with them forever, feeling she might cry for being so moved, as she had never received such love in her previous life. Her parents hugged her tightly, assuring her that she was not alone and didn't need to worry by herself. Although they didn't know the truth, her feelings of guilt and gratitude for their great kindness grew. She hugged her father, secretly wondering if she would ever have the courage to tell them the painful truth that she was not their real daughter. A few days later, Espin went to Prince Luciano's palace to fulfill the promise of friendship she had made at the tea party. She stood before the door, ready to begin her role as the story's heroine, and knocked enthusiastically. She entered the room with a brilliant smile and greeted the prince, and introduced herself again with cheerful confidence. She wondered to herself if he had been anxiously awaiting her arrival, but Luciano's reaction was cold and surprising, mentioning he had told the guards to turn away visitors, to which Espin replied in surprise that she had sent a request letter beforehand. He stood stiffly and replied with extreme coldness that he didn't remember replying to that letter and that he was busy right now. When he asked her to leave and go back the way she came, Espin was shocked, as she hadn't expected things to turn out this way. She realized he had deliberately ignored her letter, while she had naively assumed that no reply meant consent. So she firmly decided that having come this far, she would not be driven away so easily. Espin tried to remind Prince Luciano of her previous offer of friendship, assuring him her words were not out of pity or a whim, but were completely sincere and pleaded with him to give her a little time. She justified her persistence by saying they couldn't get to know each other without meeting and used her secret weapon, puppy dog eyes, believing in the saying that kindness is the best way to melt a cold heart. But Luciano scoffed at her attempt, calling it ridiculous, and defined her concept of friendship as an invasion of privacy and visiting without prior permission. He turned his back coldly, declaring he didn't need a friend who lacked basic manners, and ordered her to leave before he returned. He slammed the door behind him, leaving her alone in the room. Espin was furious, clenching her fists and trembling with anger, cursing him as an idiot. She imagined giving the Empress a few hard punches, condemning his arrogant behavior, and how he thought he could speak as he pleased, especially after she had defended him in front of the Empress at the tea party. He shouldn't be so cruel. She calmed down a bit, admitting to herself that it was her fault for assuming silence meant consent. She also blamed him for not explicitly refusing. If he had, she wouldn't have bothered coming. She took a deep breath and tried to cheer up, realizing that playing the role of the heroine wasn't easy and the beginning was always rough. She recalled the details of the original novel, how Luciano always suffered from a lack of trust in others due to constant assassination attempts, and how he went through many conflicts before getting close to the original heroine, Brianna. She deduced that his current hostile attitude was nothing more than a natural defense mechanism to protect himself. She decided not to be impatient and to keep trying, believing that if she continued to show him her sincerity, Luciano would one day open his heart to her. Espin began to write letters seriously and regularly, from simple greetings and inquiries about his well-being to politely requesting a meeting when time permitted. But Luciano did not grant her visits easily, and things between them became a battle of spear and shield, with her letters being constantly rejected. After sending more than 10 letters and putting in all that effort, she felt extremely frustrated. She rolled around on her bed, complaining and screaming childishly, wondering why he had rejected her again and realizing that things wouldn't go smoothly even for the story's heroine. Her nanny, Diana, intervened and comforted her, so Espin asked if she was a bad person that no one wanted to be friends with, but the nanny denied it, assuring her she was a very lovely girl. The nanny noticed that despite everything, Espin was preparing to send another letter. Espin grumbled that she was getting tired of the constant rejections, so the nanny suggested stopping the correspondence, implying the prince wasn't ready to get close to anyone. Espin admitted that her letters were probably annoying to Luciano, but she couldn't stop. She remembered the image of him sitting alone at the table and thought how she could possibly leave him alone after seeing that with her own eyes. She knew he had to endure loneliness until he grew up. She wanted to be a source of strength for him so he wouldn't feel lonely. Besides, she had another motive. She had to stay by the prince's side to be able to meet the second male lead, Harrison, who would later appear as Luciano's guardian knight. Determined, she decided to send one last letter. She sealed the letter with red wax, deciding that if she was rejected this time too, she would find another way to contact him. A few days later, just as she was about to lose hope of receiving a reply, a letter arrived. She eagerly opened it and read the prince's brief approval, saying he would allow her to visit tomorrow. She was overjoyed to finally get permission to visit, and the palace seemed to brighten in her eyes. At the appointed time, she entered Prince Luciano's room with a bright and brilliant smile, greeting him enthusiastically. Espin began to introduce herself again, asking the prince to call her by her name. Espin. The prince sarcastically asked if anyone had ever told her she was a bit slow-witted. Espin had thought his permission to visit meant a change in his feelings. She found that his difficult personality hadn't changed at all. She tried to lighten the mood with a cheerful laugh, claiming she was often described as clever. But Luciano replied sarcastically, asking if the definition of clever had changed, pointing out her inability to understand his repeated rejections. Espin felt frustrated, telling herself that heroes in novels usually soften in front of a sunny heroine, but he still seemed completely displeased. She told Luciano that she actually understood what he meant, which surprised him. Espin then decided to be completely honest, confessing that she pretended not to understand his rejections because she wanted to see him so badly, wondering inwardly if he would still continue to reject her after this frank confession. Luciano stared at her stiffly and asked for the reason, so she once again assured him she just wanted to be his friend. His expression turned to suspicion, saying that if she was doing this because of what happened at the tea party, there was no need to play the role of a friend. Espin immediately realized the misunderstanding. He thought she was being forced to befriend him due to her stance in front of the Empress, or that he believed she was one of Empress Isabel's minions, playing a role designed for her. Espin sighed sadly that his thoughts had gone to such a dark place. Espin walked towards him and said firmly that she didn't care what others thought and that her desire for friendship came sincerely from her heart. She looked at him with shining eyes, pleading with him to give her a little time in the future to prove she had no hidden intentions. Luciano clenched his fists nervously and muttered that something like friendship was something other people accepted. Then he turned his back coldly, said he wasn't that kind of person, and ordered her to find someone else and leave. Espin immediately realized that insisting now was useless, so she decided to make a smart retreat and thanked him for his time. She left the room with a sigh, but quickly encouraged herself, considering it progressed that their conversation today was longer than usual. She enthusiastically raised her fist, renewing her vow not to give up until she became Luciano's friend. Meanwhile, Luciano watched her leave from the window, telling himself painfully that it was impossible for someone like him to have friends, that having a trustworthy friend was impossible. In his world, after getting that permission to visit, Espin began to frequent the prince's palace, greeting him energetically every morning. Although Luciano's replies were always brief and cold, the fact that he didn't kick her out was enough to make her feel comfortable. On the days she stayed home, Espin began to record and organize information from the original novel. Based on her memory as a reader, she tried to map out future events, characters, and trends in the capital. But the main problem was that the events of the original novel started after the characters were adults, whereas she was now living in the past period that was only briefly mentioned in a side story. She jotted down some notes that might be useful later, though they were of little use for now. She lay on her bed, thinking about the lack of information about this period, aside from the fact that Luciano had suffered from a lack of trust since childhood. She felt disappointed that the heroine's privilege wasn't melting the ice between them as quickly as she had expected. Espin told herself the prince's personality was even worse than she had imagined. But soon, her opinion changed when she thought about his situation, and she forgave him, as his reaction was natural given that he had no one by his side. She remembered that although he was a prince and the hero of the story, the current Luciano was just a 9-year-old child surrounded by enemies and the shadow of danger. As the current heroine, she decided she had no choice but to understand him, especially since there was plenty of time before the original timeline began, giving her a chance to win his friendship. The days passed, and the seasons changed, until Espin had lived in this world for almost a full year. During a tea break in the garden, Espin desperately asked her nanny if her current situation was acceptable, as she still hadn't succeeded in befriending Luciano. The nanny tried to comfort her, pointing out that she thought their relationship was improving and mentioned a small piece of evidence. The prince had said one more word today than yesterday, wondering if that counted as progress. During that period, Espin's visits were one-sided, with only a few pleasantries exchanged, while Luciano coldly continued to read his book. The prince's heart remained closed to her constant attempts. The relationship was so fragile and vague that she felt everything would end immediately if Luciano decided to forbid her visits one day. Anxiety began to seep into Espin's heart, feeling that she was still stuck in the same place and wondering fearfully what would happen if the original heroine, Brianna, appeared while she was still stuck. She turned to her nanny and seriously asked if there was a special secret to making friends, but the nanny replied regretfully that the last time she made a friend was many years ago. Espin felt frustrated, as the nanny was the only person she could ask. She sadly recalled that before the Tea Party incident, there had been children who wanted to be her friend, but they all cut ties once they learned she was frequenting Luciano's place. The nanny suddenly suggested preparing a gift for the prince, which piqued Espin's interest. The nanny reminded her that she always went to the prince's palace empty-handed. Espin imagined Luciano's sarcastic reaction, as if he might think she was treating his place like a tea house if she only brought food, but she figured bringing cake was better than nothing. She then realized that with every visit, she was taking from him without offering anything in return, thinking that receiving a gift might be proof of their closeness. The nanny admitted she didn't know what His Highness liked, but confirmed that no one would dislike a thoughtful gift. Espin agreed with this logic and began to rack her brain, trying to recall if the original novel had mentioned Luciano's preferences. Suddenly, her eyes lit up and she excitedly told her nanny she knew exactly what to prepare. The nanny asked in surprise if she was sure. So Espin confirmed with complete confidence and a brilliant smile that His Highness would definitely like this gift. On her next visit, Espin entered the prince's room carrying a covered basket and greeted him energetically. Luciano looked at her suspiciously and seriously asked the reason for her brilliant smile, which he described as creepy. Espin wasn't offended by his comment, as she was used to it. Instead, she was very excited to reveal her secret weapon. She cheerfully told him that she always came empty-handed, so today she had brought him a gift. Today, Espin excitedly uncovered the basket, revealing fresh cheese muffins. She asked for his opinion, pointing out that they smelled delicious, and her choice was based on a precise detail from the original novel, that Luciano disliked sweets. She remembered that his hatred for sweets stemmed from his firm belief that such things would make him weak. In the original novel, although Luciano hated sweets, only one thing had managed to win his approval. That was the cheese muffins offered by the original heroine, Brianna. Relying on this information, Espin offered him the basket with a brilliant smile, inviting him to eat them together while they were still warm. Espin hesitantly offered him the muffins, but he remained standing, staring at her in silence. Espin, thinking his hesitation was due to concerns about the taste, asked if he was worried they wouldn't be good. She quickly assured him that she had already tried them herself, and not only were they not tasteless, but they were very delicious, confirming that she would never force him to eat them if he didn't like the taste. However, his reaction was completely unexpected. His expression suddenly turned furious, and he harshly questioned when he had ever asked her to bring such things and why she was imposing something he had not requested. Startled by his hostile tone, Espin trembled as she tried to defend herself, explaining that she had only brought them to repay his kindness in allowing her to visit, considering it basic courtesy. But Luciano sneered at her, refusing to accept her explanation and declaring that he was well aware this must be part of some conspiracy. Suddenly, he made a shocking accusation directly to her, saying she had poisoned the muffins. Espin's eyes widened in horror as she shrieked in disbelief, repeating the word poison and asking why he would think she would do something so heinous. Luciano replied with a somber gaze that reflected his painful experiences, saying that she would surely benefit if something happened to him, and mentioned that he had seen many people like her before. Heartbroken, Espin tried to remind him that she had persistently come to see him for the entire past year, just so he wouldn't feel lonely. But her words only increased Luciano's suspicion, as he accused her of waiting so long just to find the right moment to show her true colors, just like everyone else. He coldly ordered her to leave with her gift and warned her never to return to his palace, then turned his back on her. Espin stood frozen, tears welling up in her eyes, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She had only wanted to show kindness. How had things turned into such a disaster? Espin realized that instead of helping Luciano, she had hurt him, and she couldn't let things end like this. She knew that leaving now would only confirm his suspicions, causing Luciano to sink deeper into a mire of distrust. She suddenly let out a loud scream, making Luciano stop in his tracks, and told him she would prove it to him. She grabbed a muffin and, speaking nervously and quickly, said she would eat all of them right now, and if she was unharmed after finishing, it would be definitive proof that there was no poison. She began to forcefully stuff the muffins into her mouth, causing a panicked Luciano to turn around and scream at her to stop and get out, but she refused, insisting on proving her innocence. As she ate, she told him that she understood he couldn't trust her, but she had truly never thought of harming him, pleading with him to let her prove she was not an enemy. She continued eating with a desperate look on her face to confirm the bread was safe. Luciano watched her in astonishment, describing her actions as utterly ridiculous and questioning if she thought he would trust her just because she ate a muffin like she was acting in a play. He demanded she stop doing these meaningless things, but Espin replied that she couldn't stop because it was the only thing she could do right now. In that moment, Espin realized her fatal mistake. Ever since waking up in this world, she had arrogantly believed she was the protagonist of the story, and that all events and characters would revolve around her. She had assumed everyone would act according to her will to achieve her happy ending. She admitted to herself that she had been too complacent. While this was a world from a novel to her, for these people, it was their actual reality. She realized a truth she had completely overlooked. They were not just characters, but independent individuals with their own emotions and lives. Espin continued eating the muffins down to the last piece, telling herself she was no longer just a reader, but a part of this reality, and blamed herself for her naive enthusiasm to be the protagonist before. To play the part of the protagonist well, she swallowed the last muffin, hoping this act would dispel Luciano's anxiety and prove her good intentions. With a triumphant and brilliant smile, she presented the empty basket to him, confirming the muffins were not poisoned and that she was completely fine, just as she had promised. But Luciano looked at her and described her actions as foolish. Espin smiled and asked if he would now let go of his suspicions after seeing all this, but her body began to send alarm signals. Suddenly, a chill ran through her body, her vision blurred, and her stomach felt like it was contracting violently. She covered her mouth with her hand, thinking in fear if she had gotten indigestion from eating too quickly at such a terrible time. She decided to leave immediately before he noticed and made things worse, nervously bidding him farewell. But Luciano noticed her paleness and asked, seriously and anxiously, if she was really okay. He grabbed her hand to stop her from leaving, pointed at her pale face, and admitted that the muffins might have really been a problem. Espin, panicked, stammered a denial. But the truth was, the amount of food was more than she could handle, and her stomach could take no more. Suddenly, she lost control and vomited in front of him, leaving Luciano utterly shocked. Espin collapsed on the ground in agony, wiping her mouth and trying to explain that what happened was not because of poison. She looked at him with tears in her eyes, hoping he would believe her. Crying, she confessed that her previous actions might have been selfish, but swore she had never intended to harm His Highness. Her consciousness began to fade, her mind filled with the fear that her fainting now would convince Luciano of the poison's existence. Her body swayed, and she lost consciousness, with Luciano screaming her name as he tried to catch her before she hit the ground. In her last moments of awareness, she felt despair, wondering why nothing ever went according to plan and whether she could truly survive in this cruel world. In the darkness of her consciousness, she kept apologizing, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes, affirming that she had not meant to hurt him. She apologized sincerely and ceaselessly, while the prince seemed to be looking at her with eyes full of confusion and pain. The prince caressed her face, wondering why a girl like her would go to such lengths and what she could possibly gain by approaching him, unable to understand her motives. Espin finally woke up in her room at the Samuel family residence to find her mother by her side. She eagerly called out to her mother, who gently asked about her condition, and Espin assured her she was perfectly fine. Her mother told her how shocked she was to hear the news of her collapse and told her to focus only on resting for now. Espin learned that it was Luciano who had immediately contacted her family on the day she collapsed and arranged for a carriage to take her home, and that her parents had been devastated when she arrived in that state. She felt guilty for worrying everyone, but tried to comfort her mother with a bright smile, claiming she had been eating and sleeping well and was now full of energy. Now, her mother looked at her affectionately, gently took her hand, and said she had something to tell her. She reminded Espin that she and her father would always be on her side, and as long as she stayed healthy, she was free to do whatever she wanted, promising her not to worry. Her mother gently kissed her daughter's forehead and told her to rest for a while. Espin sat on the edge of her bed, nervously swinging her legs, trying to suppress the urge to run back to the prince's palace, telling herself she had to pull herself together. Her nanny, Diana, interrupted her thoughts, looking at her with a gaze full of confusion and concern. Espin smiled at her nanny, who commented that the way she had just comforted her mother made everyone feel like she had suddenly grown up. Espin replied that, in fact, she felt she had been mature for a long time. Espin began to think deeply about her new life, how she had entered this body, and where the real Espin had gone. But seeing how much love and care her new parents gave her made her realize something important. She was certain that her parents, her nanny, and everyone in the residence genuinely cared for her. So she decided to stop being anxious and obsessed with playing the role of the novel's protagonist. In a calm voice, she called for her nanny and asked her to send one last letter. She explained to her worried nanny that she just wanted to apologize for her impolite behavior in front of Prince Luciano and confirmed that there were no other intentions behind the letter. Espin cleverly deduced that despite what had happened that day, there were no negative rumors about her, which meant Luciano had suppressed the incident and protected her, so she felt it was her duty to apologize and thank him. She picked up a pen and began to write earnestly, vowing to herself that she would never bother His Highness again after this letter. Nanny Diana watched the little girl with tears in her eyes, moved by this sudden maturity and difficult decision. But Espin faced it all with a wide, brilliant smile, convincing herself it was the right thing to do and that her desire to support Luciano was just a selfish wish, deciding to focus on what she could do from her own position from now on. She resolved to live a full and happy life, far from the complex entanglements of the original story. However, shortly after making this decision, a formal invitation arrived, completely turning the situation around. The invitation was addressed to Dear Espin Samuel and was filled with flowery language about the fresh air of spring, announcing a tea party at the royal palace in a week. The invitation was signed by Queen Isabel Frederick, who claimed in the letter that she had been very worried after hearing Espin was sick and unable to attend the previous event. On a beautiful, sunny day, Espin found herself in a carriage on her way to the royal palace to meet the queen. Although she would have preferred to stay home, she realized this was not just an ordinary gathering, but an event for the prince to make friends, and she truly wished she could have used her illness as an excuse to be absent. She remembered the words in the invitation, where the queen claimed she had postponed the entire event until Espin recovered and could join them. The letter invited her to enjoy the time together after her recovery, the psychological pressure within it obvious. Espin analyzed the situation with suspicion. The queen had been silent for a whole year, so why summon her now? She suspected the queen might be planning revenge for last year's incident. The queen wasn't the only problem. Luciano was too, as this would be their first meeting since that day, and she didn't know what to expect. The carriage stopped, and the driver announced their arrival, making Espin extremely nervous. She stepped out of the carriage and stood before the luxurious palace, realizing there was no turning back now. She had to bravely face whatever was to come and perhaps try to make a new friend. A servant greeted her at the entrance, confirmed her identity as Miss Espin Samuel, and offered to escort her to her seat. Espin noticed a strange change in the rules this time. Guardians were not allowed to attend, and aside from the servants, there were no adults present, which aroused her suspicion. As she followed the servant, she secretly wondered what kind of plot was brewing. The servant politely pointed out her seat, and Espin thanked him, but she was shocked when she saw its location. It was very far from the central main table, in an isolated and semi-hidden spot. She realized they were blatantly and obviously discriminating against her, but she tried to console herself that this situation at least wouldn't harm her family's honor, and perhaps she should be grateful for the distance. Espin tried to push the negative thoughts out of her mind, deciding to stop thinking about royal matters and instead focus on her new goal, making friends. She looked around until her gaze fell on a group of children nearby. She greeted them warmly and tried to introduce herself, but their reaction was shocking. They completely ignored her, walking away coldly and continuing to chat among themselves. Espin realized the task would not be easy, as they were avoiding her because of her closeness to Prince Luciano, so she decided to try someone else. Her gaze fell on the girl from the last tea party, whom she remembered was named Betty. Espin called out to her gently, but Betty deliberately ignored her, instead calling loudly for the other girls to gather around her. Espin sat in surprise, watching as Betty whispered to the other girls, who then started looking at her and letting out obvious sounds of ridicule. Seeing the malicious smile on Betty's face, Espin realized the overall atmosphere wasn't just avoidance because of Luciano, but deliberate contempt. Espin sat alone in her isolated seat at the back, while the group of children continued to look at her arrogantly. Espin quickly analyzed the situation, certain that this was not a personal act, but that Queen Isabel had ordered Betty, who was seen as the center of the group, to do it. She understood the plan was designed to isolate and demoralize her, in order to mold her according to the queen's will. But Espin was dismissive of these childish attempts. Even if she felt a little angry, she wasn't a 9-year-old child who would cry over it. She told herself that compared to the chaos she had caused in front of Luciano, this bullying was nothing. She suddenly noticed that she could now say the prince's name fluently. Suddenly, she sensed movement beside her and turned to find Prince Luciano standing right there. This startled her greatly. She tried to salvage the situation, nervously greeting him and apologizing for not being able to greet him properly last time, while inwardly wondering why he had arrived so early when she wasn't mentally prepared. Luciano replied with his usual coldness, a brief "I know," making Espin feel that his cold demeanor hadn't changed at all. The atmosphere was broken by the arrival of Queen Isabel, accompanied by the second prince. The queen told Luciano in a chiding tone not to be so stiff, especially since his friend Espin was present. Espin welcomed the queen's arrival and apologized for her delayed greeting, all while thinking about the queen's malice, deliberately seating her in the back and now feigning cordiality. But she still responded with proper, polite rhetoric. With a cunning smile, the queen told Espin not to worry, that she was glad she could join, and invited everyone to enjoy the tea party. While everyone else was mingling and laughing, the table where Luciano and Espin sat was filled with silence and stiffness. The queen announced that this year she had decided not to invite any adults so the children could enjoy themselves freely, and maliciously asked if this made anyone uncomfortable. Betty stepped forward and replied with obvious flattery that they were not little children anymore, but were all mature, thanking the queen for her consideration. The queen thanked them for the compliment, while Espin watched the scene coldly, thinking it was nothing special. Espin noted with sadness how these children had so skillfully learned hypocrisy and flattery from adults, and how eager Betty seemed to be to win Isabel's approval. Espin sat uncomfortably in her seat, forced to observe the silent Luciano's mood, wishing the party would end soon so she could go home. The queen broke the silence, asking with false reproach why Prince Luciano was so quiet when everyone was having fun, especially when his friend had come all this way to see him. The queen cunningly claimed that Espin might feel hurt by the prince's silence. Espin realized the queen wouldn't let her off the hook and was expecting her to turn the topic to her. Espin quickly denied it with a nervous smile, claiming she still felt a bit unwell and that the prince was being considerate by staying quiet so she wouldn't get tired. The queen picked up on this with a malicious smile, recalling that Espin had mentioned in her letter that her illness wasn't serious. With a sharp, cunning gaze, the queen directly asked Espin an embarrassing question, inquiring how she had gotten sick. Espin immediately realized she had fallen into the queen's trap and found she had no choice but to stammer in confusion and admit she had eaten a bit too much. The queen didn't stop there, but continued, alluding to rumors about a recent incident at the prince's palace, and asking suspiciously if Espin was really sure nothing had happened. Then she gave a malicious example, implying that she might have been bullied. In that moment, Espin realized the truth. This was the real reason the queen had summoned her. She wanted to see her betray Luciano in front of everyone. Espin wondered in surprise if the queen had waited a whole year for this opportunity, waiting for the right moment after that incident with the prince. As Espin remained silent, the queen urged her to speak, promising to protect her from any retaliation if she was afraid. Espin decided to play along, feeling a sense of relief at hearing those words of assurance, and resolved to be completely honest. She admitted in front of everyone that she had indeed been bullied, which caused whispers and shock among the attendees. The queen feigned shock and anger, declaring that as a royal adult, she could not ignore bullying that occurred within the palace. She asked with false seriousness who the culprit was. She glanced at Luciano out of the corner of her eye, waiting for Espin to say his name. But Espin raised her hand and confidently pointed to another girl, saying she was the one who had bullied her. Espin screamed, accusing Betty of being the one who bullied her, causing Betty to freeze in shock. Luciano looked at Espin in astonishment, unable to believe what was happening. Betty tried to defend herself, denying the accusation in a trembling voice, but Espin confronted her, saying she had deliberately ignored her greeting just moments ago, and then laughed with the other children as if it were funny. Betty stammered, trying to explain. She quickly moved closer to the queen to save the situation, claiming that Espin had misunderstood and that Betty was just enjoying a conversation. The queen insisted with a strained smile that it was just bad timing and asked Espin to reconsider carefully. Then she maliciously asked if anyone else besides Betty had bullied her, desperately trying to turn the accusation back to the prince. But Espin sat calmly and said that if Betty's bullying wasn't intentional, then it was fine, and confirmed there was no one else, thus blocking the queen's path to accuse Luciano. The queen, not giving up, continued to press, pointing out that she knew Espin was being cautious. she had heard something else. Mentioning that the Samuel family's carriage had come to the palace to pick up Espin on the day, she suddenly collapsed. That day, Espin felt the fear of being exposed as the queen began to corner her with questions to get the answer she wanted. The queen coldly suggested that it would be wise to clarify exactly what happened before strange rumors could spread to protect the honor of the royal family. The queen turned her aim to Luciano, saying that if Espin had trouble explaining, perhaps the prince, who was with her at the time, should answer. Luciano appeared nervous, trying to justify it by saying there were unavoidable circumstances at the time. The queen interrupted him with a demonic smile, wondering what kind of circumstances would drive him to hide things like this, implying his personal involvement in harming her. Seeing the fear in Luciano's eyes, Espin realized that remaining silent would allow harmful misunderstandings about him to escalate. She decided that after all that had happened, she couldn't cause him any more trouble. She cut off the queen's speech, stood up bravely, and loudly declared that what happened that day was entirely her fault and that she was responsible for her own collapse. Espin was deeply ashamed to reveal her childish mistake in front of this crowd, but realized her pride was nothing compared to Luciano's suffering. She decided to confess the whole truth, explaining that her collapse that day and her subsequent illness were not due to any conspiracy or poison, but the result of her gluttony. The queen raised an eyebrow in surprise at the word gluttony. Espin continued with childlike honesty, explaining that the muffins she had bought were so delicious that she couldn't stop, ending up eating the prince's share as well, which led to severe indigestion. The queen asked in astonishment if she was saying she had collapsed simply from eating too much, which Espin confirmed with extreme embarrassment. The queen flew into a rage, describing her words as absurd nonsense. The attendees began to whisper about the queen's unusual anger, surprised by her exaggerated reaction to a child. One of the girls looked frightened, and the girl next to her tried to calm her down. Realizing she had lost her composure and spoken to Espin for too long, which might arouse suspicion, the queen tried to save the situation and change the subject. She asked another girl named Hazel for her opinion on the refreshments, and Hazel nervously replied that they were the most delicious she had ever had. Meanwhile, Espin was thinking about the queen's pettiness, expecting that she would not be invited to royal gatherings again. She looked at Luciano, realizing she probably wouldn't see him for a long time either, and anticipated that such difficult situations would continue to arise in the future. But she remembered that Luciano was the male lead, and he would eventually overcome all difficulties and achieve his happy ending. She decided to back off now, cheer for him from distance, and leave the stage for the original heroine when her time came. I think being the protagonist is too tiring, realizing that the main character is always at the center of storms and problems. After that incident and the chaos caused by the queen, Espin thought she would never return to the palace. But a surprise awaited her. She found herself invited again, and this time it was a private invitation from Prince Luciano himself. She sat before him, speechless with surprise, while he personally poured her tea, and she wondered if it was really tea she could drink. She couldn't believe her eyes, thinking she was dreaming, so she pinched her cheek to confirm and felt the pain. Luciano asked in surprise what she was doing, and she stammered that her cheek hurt a little. She watched in amazement as Luciano poured her tea, unable to believe this was happening in reality, and wondered what on earth had happened to him to cause such a change. She nervously thanked him and promised to drink it well, and as she tasted the tea, suddenly, her eyes widened in surprise as she tasted the tea. It was perfect, with just the right temperature and aroma, and completely free of the usual bitterness, which made her wonder if this was another one of the male lead's talents. Luciano noticed her expression and asked the reason, so she honestly told him the tea was very delicious. Luciano smiled in satisfaction, pointing out there was plenty more and inviting her to drink as much as she wanted, and Espin happily thanked him. The silence continued for a moment, and Espin wondered what she should do in this awkward atmosphere. Luciano sat nervously, as if he wanted to say something, but he hesitated. Espin decided waiting was not her style and took the initiative to ask directly. She boldly confronted him, wanting to know if His Highness had summoned her to tell her something, while also confirming that if he had nothing to say, she would have to leave, as she realized he was quite busy too. Luciano seemed very hesitant. He mumbled a few words, then composed himself and asked in a faint voice when she would come next time. Espin looked at him in surprise and asked a short question in return, so he repeated his question with a noticeable stutter and confusion, asking about the time of her next visit. The scene shifts to Espin's room, where she's lying on her bed, completely absent-minded, prompting her nanny, Diana, to ask anxiously if something had happened with Prince Luciano again. The nanny had noticed Espin had been out of it all day, so Espin replied slowly in a state of shock, admitting that something strange had indeed happened. She recalled the scene of Luciano asking when she would come again. Although she had waited a long time for the moment Luciano would approach her, his tone didn't seem as joyful as she had imagined. Unable to understand the reason for his sudden change in attitude, she directly asked if he didn't hate seeing her. She told him that their relationship had been one-sided since they first met, which prompted Espin to ask why he was suddenly talking about meeting. He turned his face away again and replied in a faint voice that it was his responsibility, explaining that the recent misfortunes she had encountered were all because of him. Espin asked in confusion what he meant, so he told her it was too long to explain and suggested she come again next time if she wanted to hear the details. Espin noticed his hesitation and asked if he wanted her to stay a little longer, but he quickly denied it. Espin assured him that despite his worries, she was fine and there was no need to force himself to spend time with her out of a sense of duty, reminding him that he had already endured her one-sided persistence for over a year and that she had no intention of bothering him anymore. Suddenly, Luciano placed his hand on the door to stop her from leaving, denying that she was a bother to him. He looked at her seriously and said that 1 year was not enough, asking her to try a little harder and set a meeting date for 2 in the afternoon the day after tomorrow. Espin went back and told her nanny what had happened in amazement, wondering what on earth he expected from her. She lay on her bed in confusion, thinking about his contradictory behavior, pushing her away when she got close, then holding her back when she tried to leave. Although she had decided not to care about it anymore, she remembered how she had previously tried to win Luciano's heart by playing the role of a cheerful protagonist, but she gave up because she realized that recklessly interfering with the story's path without preparation would cause harm to others. Recalling Luciano's hurt and the difficult situation her parents were put in before the queen, she tried to reduce her meetings with him as much as possible. Espin grumbled and complained like a child, unsure how to react to his sudden actions, while her nanny, Diana, watched her gently. Diana gently suggested that while she might not know the reason for his change, her sincerity might have finally moved him. Espin pondered these words, and Diana encouraged her to press on. She was surprised that he found it so difficult to frankly express his desire to see her, and deep down, she wondered if he truly wanted to get closer to her. Meanwhile, Luciano was quietly sipping tea in his palace, a sign that his feelings were beginning to truly change. Espin noticed that Prince Luciano had invited her for tea again today. This piqued her curiosity, and she hesitantly asked if he disliked eating and drinking with others. He replied in surprise that he had invited her for tea before, reminding her that she complained when he didn't invite her and now grumbled when he did. Espin explained that the issue wasn't the act itself, but the cold reaction that came with it. She was lost in thought, recalling his stern and cruel gaze the last time she brought him muffins. She contrasted that situation with his current behavior and found that he had changed so much he was like a different person, which made her wonder just how much guilt he felt toward her to drive such a drastic change. She decided to return to their previous topic of conversation, reminding him that he had said what happened to her was his responsibility and deducing from his words that she had suffered misfortune because of him more than once. Luciano admitted her deduction was correct, but Espin, unclear on what harm she had suffered, asked him to clarify. Luciano pretended to think for a moment before simply claiming he had forgotten, reasoning that she had said he didn't need to take responsibility. This angered Espin, and she yelled at him, upset that he was manipulating her feelings and concerns. Luciano quietly set his teacup aside and admitted he was joking, but then seriously confirmed that if she didn't feel she had been harmed, there was no need to tell her. He argued that knowing the truth would make her overthink and feel pained later, which he didn't want. He asked her to ignore his sensitive reaction at the time and continue to interact with him naturally, as if nothing had happened. As he spoke, Espin noticed something odd about his demeanor and suddenly interrupted him, pointing out that he was speaking differently than usual. Luciano was surprised by her observation and asked what she meant. Espin asked in surprise if he had just been addressing her formally or politely, pointing out that he had never properly used her name before, instead using vague pronouns. Luciano smiled, saying it was impressive that she had persisted in visiting him despite realizing this. Espin tried to cut him off to stop him from changing the subject. Luciano honestly explained that he had decided to show her a degree of respect because she had proven herself to be an honest and loyal person. Espin was bewildered and shy at the sudden praise, wondering when she had started to earn such a generous evaluation from him. A cute image of him giving her things flashed through her mind, and she wondered if this change stemmed from the muffin incident. She hesitantly asked if he was referring to that old matter, while thinking to herself, I can't just confess. When I ate the muffins and then threw up. Luciano affirmed her thought, saying that in that moment, he realized she possessed true courage. Luciano went on to explain that even though everyone had been against him in that situation, she had never once blamed him, instead believing that fainting was entirely her own fault. Espin felt embarrassed, secretly wondering if her disgraceful behavior at the time counted as courage in his eyes, and whether she should be happy about this misunderstanding. She closed her eyes, thinking that she did want them to become closer, but she had never intended for him to take any responsibility. She looked at him and saw in his eyes a person who had never trusted anyone before, but was now reaching out to her, and she couldn't help but accept the outstretched hand. Wringing her hands, she shyly asked him if they were friends now. Luciano looked at her and asked if he had to say it out loud. Espin enthusiastically affirmed that this kind of thing had to be said clearly and directly. Luciano smiled sincerely and said clearly that he wanted her to be his friend. Espin gazed at his smiling face, surprised that he could smile so beautifully. A wave of warmth washed over her, as if everything was going to be all right, and accepting his friendship was the right decision. With a radiant smile full of happiness, she made one last request to seal their friendship, that he call her by her name, Espin, instead of just you. Luciano asked Espin for her name, looking at her seriously. She answered enthusiastically, but she soon found it strange when he addressed her as you instead of by her name, stating that the word you felt distant between friends. She commented that it felt cliché every time she heard him say, which surprised Luciano. She thought to herself that this was normal, as he was still a 10-year-old boy, which made him despair at her frankness, placing a hand on his forehead. Espin, with a bright smile, encouraged him to say her name naturally, urging him to try saying Espin. Luciano hesitated for a moment, then uttered her name in a faint, hesitant voice. Espin felt immense happiness and blushed as if she had achieved a great accomplishment. Luciano was surprised by her exaggerated reaction after he finally said her name. Espin smiled shyly, admitting she hadn't expected him to actually say it, leading Luciano to comment irritably on her lack of faith in him. Espin admitted to herself that she had always felt he wasn't like a child, but seeing this reaction confirmed for her that he was indeed still very young. Espin smiled happily, expressing her admiration for him acting his age. From that day on, Luciano began to accept Espin's spontaneous and casual behavior without showing any displeasure. They reached a stage of closeness, playing chess together, with Luciano winning a game by checkmate. Espin grumbled about her loss and demanded another game. Luciano refused, suggesting they do something else and reminding her of their bet. Espin insisted on fulfilling the bet, asking him to flick her forehead as a penalty for the loser and closing her eyes nervously. Luciano initially refused, but Espin insisted that a bet was a bet. She waited for the flick, feeling nervous and wondering how strong a 10-year-old boy could be. She commented that although Luciano was young, as the protagonist of the novel, he was actually very strong. At the same time, she worried her forehead would swell and bruise after being flicked. Suddenly, she felt a very light touch on her forehead. She opened her eyes in surprise and asked if he had just flicked her, to which Luciano simply gave an affirmative answer. Espin protested that it wasn't a real flick and that she would consider the bet void if he didn't do it properly, but Luciano reassured her that wouldn't happen and asked what they wanted to do next. Espin realized that Luciano had begun to treat her with unprecedented gentleness, even going easy on her in their bet, and felt their relationship had become even more comfortable than she had imagined. Overwhelming happiness washed over her, so much so that she momentarily forgot about the tragic fate of the first prince in the original novel. After spending a few days at the Imperial Palace, Espin suddenly felt hungry. Luciano asked if she wanted something to eat and suggested making tea, but Espin told him that wouldn't be filling, implying she wanted a snack. Luciano told her to wait a moment and then stood up. Espin watched him walk over to a side cabinet, surprised that he kept snacks in his room. Luciano returned with a bright red apple and handed it to her. Espin sat on the sofa, looking at the apple in surprise. Luciano simply told her that since she said she was hungry, he got her an apple. Espin noticed the unpeeled apple and was surprised that the prince had saved a dessert, inwardly wondering if the reason was that he didn't want to eat it. And so, she took the apple from Prince Luciano, stammering a confused thank you. Espin thought to herself that Luciano didn't have many people around him, but she found it strange that not a single person peeled fruit for him. Her surprise grew when she realized he was hiding fruit in his room, wondering suspiciously if he was forced to source his own food. Seeing him eat an apple with the peel on, she anxiously asked if he ate his main meals like that as well. To this, he replied with a serious expression that chefs were easily bribed. Espin was stunned, realizing he had been taking care of his own meals all this time because he didn't trust the palace chefs. She deduced that his skill in making tea was because he always did it himself, not letting anyone serve him. She realized he had suffered greatly because of Isabel, who had made him suspicious even of the people working in his own palace. For fear of being poisoned, Espin suddenly jumped up, realizing the situation was even more dangerous than she had thought, and confirmed in her mind that he needed to eat well during this growth period. She grabbed his hand tightly and demanded he leave with her for a moment, as this situation could not be ignored. He asked in surprise what she was doing, as she dragged him along behind her, enthusiastically saying they were going to get something delicious to eat. They arrived at the gates of the Samuel family residence, where the butler welcomed the young lady home. Espin asked him to prepare a lavish dinner for that evening, as she had brought a guest. Luciano was curious about the reason for being brought to the Samuel house so hastily and strangely. The butler immediately recognized Prince Luciano, his expression turning to one of utter surprise. He bowed with extreme reverence, expressing his honor at receiving such a distinguished guest, while Luciano politely apologized for the sudden visit. Without prior notice, a servant regretfully informed them that the Earl and Countess were not currently at the residence. Espin quickly replied that it was fine, as she wasn't there to see her parents, stressing only that they ensure the food was prepared with the utmost care. Luciano nervously whispered to Espin that this was too sudden and he felt he was troubling her. Espin replied firmly that it had to be sudden to be safe. She explained that since it was a spontaneous and unplanned outing, no one would have had the chance to interfere or poison the food. Luciano looked at her in surprise, understanding her quick thinking and extreme concern for his safety. Espin smiled gently at him and invited him to hurry inside, saying that everything would be all right. Delicious dishes such as roasted meat with a special sauce and octopus cooked with potatoes and olive oil were served. Luciano sat at the table hesitantly, so Espin urged him to try the food, confirming that their chef was very skilled. Luciano took a bite of meat, and Espin asked with anticipation and anxiety how it tasted. His face turned slightly red, and his eyes widened as he said it tasted different. Espin worriedly thought he meant it tasted bad when he said it was different, but he honestly explained that he didn't know how to describe it, only that it was different from what he had eaten before. Espin looked at him with pity, thinking about how long it had been since he had a proper, safe meal, and felt a deep sadness for him whenever she thought about it. Espin enthusiastically suggested to Prince Luciano that they eat together like this often in the future. Luciano seriously rejected the idea, looking down and explaining that it couldn't happen because it would be very dangerous. Espin approached him to try and persuade him, explaining that they could act suddenly like they did today, and cleverly adding that they didn't have to meet at her house. They could go to any restaurant, as it would be difficult to bribe all the restaurants in the capital at once. Luciano pondered for a moment in the face of her logic, hesitating before finally agreeing, saying it would be fine if it only happened occasionally. Espin's expression lit up with a radiant smile, and she shouted happily, asking if he was serious, reminding him that he had made a promise, and inviting him to eat lots of delicious food together. Luciano looked at her with a warm, calm gaze and replied affirmatively in a faint voice that it was a promise. The scene suddenly shifts to a dark and oppressive, luxurious bedroom, where a man's voice is heard calling for Harrison, asking if he is there. to which Harrison, standing by the bed, gives an affirmative reply. A weak hand reached out from the bed, and the father, in a weary voice, pleaded with his son to grant this last wish for his incompetent father, hoping to see that person just one more time. Harrison sat by the bed with his head down as his father continued, expressing his desire to apologize for the sins he had committed against that person in his youth. A photograph of a young Luciano appeared on the table as the father continued his deep and pained apology. Harrison held his father's hand and, in a choked voice, begged his father not to talk about it anymore for now. Harrison lifted his pale face, his green eyes filled with pain and despair, and then confirmed to his father that he knew better than anyone that they didn't even have the right to hear any news about him. As time passed, the atmosphere brightened again, and a full 2 years passed in the blink of an eye after those events. Espin enjoyed the clinking sound of falling gold coins, noting that during that period, she had been organizing the contents of the original novel. Espin held a gold coin, gazing at it adoringly, and noticed that her rabbit-shaped piggy bank, Tuzin, was already full of coins. She was beginning to prioritize one thing above all else. Now 11 years old, Espin held a gold coin and, with a radiant smile and sparkling eyes, said to the coin that they were shining brightly today as well. Espin enthusiastically declared her life's motto, money, confirming that after accepting her life as Espin Samuel, her highest goal was to save money. She recalled how she had worked hard over the past 2 years to collect as much money as possible, even asking her father for an allowance, so that she could use all the information she knew from the original novel. Espin revealed the first investment she had finally decided to make, the Mabel dessert shop, which, according to the original plot, would steal the hearts of everyone in the capital. Espin held a letter and explained that she had requested the Adventurers Guild to find the whereabouts of the people involved, expressing satisfaction that the investigation had concluded with surprising speed. Espin put a large amount of gold coins into a cloth bag, thinking that if she was going to pay the commission and plan to persuade them with the investment money, she had to bring at least this much. The nanny noticed Espin preparing to go out and asked if she was going to the bank, as her piggy bank, Tuzin, was about to burst. Espin replied with an innocent smile that she wasn't going to the bank today, which made the nanny's expression turn to one of surprise. The nanny was so stunned her jaw dropped, and she shrieked, asking if she was going to spend money, while Espin wondered in surprise if it was really so shocking for her to use her own money. The nanny ran frantically down the hallway, shouting at the top of her lungs, calling for the master and madam to tell them the urgent news, while Espin tried in vain to stop her. The nanny burst into the Earl and Countess's office, and the father was shocked to hear that his daughter was going to spend money. Everyone recalled their memories of Espin. So far, she had only asked for her allowance in gold coins, and whenever she had the chance, she would feed the gold coins to her piggy bank, Tuzin, telling her father that Tuzin liked gold coins. They remembered how she would give her father very gentle shoulder massages, only to ask him for an allowance afterward, and then deposit every single coin in the bank, never withdrawing a single one. The father imagined Espin sitting happily on a huge pile of gold coins, while her parents wondered in shock if Espin was a greedy person. Espin was surprised by their exaggerated reaction and grumbled in discontent at the title of greedy. Espin inwardly chided them that the title was a bit cruel, especially since she was their only daughter. The father, in a tone full of curiosity and concern, asked his daughter Espin what her real plans were for the money she had worked so hard to collect. Espin explained that she had a specific investment plan in mind and that she would reveal it to them soon. The Earl and Countess exchanged glances, both curious and concerned about their daughter's mysterious business venture. Espin set out with determination, the heavy bag of gold coins secured at her side. She made her way through the bustling streets of the capital, heading toward the location provided by the Adventurers Guild. After some time, Espin arrived at a modest building that would soon become the foundation of her fortune. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door, ready to present her business proposal. A woman answered the door, looking surprised to see a young girl at her doorstep. Espin introduced herself politely and explained that she had come to discuss a potential business opportunity. The woman invited her inside, intrigued by the confident young visitor. Espin laid out her plan, explaining how the Mabel dessert shop would become renowned throughout the capital. She spoke with surprising confidence for someone her age, detailing the recipes and business strategies. The woman listened carefully, gradually becoming more interested in the proposal. Espin presented the bag of gold coins as her initial investment, demonstrating her serious commitment. The woman's eyes widened at the generous offer, and she began to consider the partnership seriously. After hours of negotiation, they reached an agreement that satisfied both parties. Espin left the building with a signed contract and a sense of accomplishment. She thought about how this investment would yield enormous returns in the coming years. Meanwhile, at the Imperial Palace, Luciano was attending to his duties as the young prince. He had grown considerably over the past 2 years, becoming more mature and composed. Despite his youth, he carried himself with the dignity of his station. He thought of Espin and wondered how she had been spending her time lately. Their friendship had remained strong, though they saw each other less frequently due to their respective responsibilities. Luciano still remembered the warmth of their meals together and the genuine care she showed for his well-being. A servant entered and informed him that he had several official matters requiring his attention. Luciano sighed and returned his focus to the documents before him. He signed each one methodically, his mind occasionally drifting back to thoughts of his friend. Back in the capital, Espin's investment began to take shape. Construction and preparations for the Mabel dessert shop commenced immediately. Espin visited the site frequently, ensuring that every detail matched her vision. She was determined to make this venture a success, just as the original novel had foretold. Within months, the dessert shop was ready to open its doors to the public. Espin felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as the grand opening day approached. She had invested so much of her time, effort, and money into this project. Now, she could only wait and see if her calculations and the knowledge from the original novel would prove correct. She returned to reality, thinking about the current problem, and deduced that her only option now was to continue visiting May and Belle to win their trust. Espin arrived at her destination, and the guard, Billy, announced their arrival, so she told him she would be back soon. Espin walked towards the shop, thinking that a week had passed since she started visiting them, hoping for a positive answer today. She was surprised to notice that the shop door was unusually open. An enticing aroma wafted into her nostrils, and she realized they were baking bread, thinking it was the perfect time to try a new method of persuasion. She pushed the door open forcefully and walked in with great enthusiasm, waving her hand and loudly announcing that she was here to invest. May sighed in resignation upon seeing Espin and, with a weary expression, asked if it wasn't time for her to give up, pointing to her frequent visits. Espin pretended to be hurt, describing her words as hurtful, and reiterated that she fully believed they could make the best desserts. But she seriously corrected herself, admitting she understood why they found it hard to trust her, especially since she had never even tasted their bread before. Based on this, Espin politely requested permission to join them for their refreshment time today. Espin smiled warmly, suggesting it was a good opportunity to taste the bread Belle made, adding that she had brought some garlic bread she baked herself to share. The atmosphere suddenly changed, and May, in a strange and serious tone, asked Espin if she really wanted to taste her bread. Espin noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Belle's expression turned gloomy and extremely fearful, while May anxiously held her hand. Espin, nervous and confused, asked if she had said something wrong, but May denied it in a faint voice. Espin stared at Belle's face, thinking her expression was too gloomy to ignore, and wondered if it was because of her presence or for some other reason. She saw fear in Belle's eyes and secretly wondered if the girl hated people tasting the bread she made. Espin deduced that if that were the case, it would explain why they had flatly refused to open a shop, but she remained puzzled about what could have caused such a situation. May suddenly invited Espin to sit down, which surprised Espin. May told Belle to serve the lady some bread. When Belle hesitated and asked if she was sure, May firmly replied that it would be faster if Espin tried it for herself. After getting permission, Espin sat at the table, observing the situation with caution and curiosity. May, with a sad expression, told her that after she tasted the bread, she would understand why they didn't want to open a shop, adding seriously that once she understood the truth, she should leave without a word. Espin then looked at her with a serious expression. Espin looked at the brownie placed before her, thinking it looked completely normal from its appearance, and wondered with curiosity and anxiety what kind of taste would make May say such a thing. Espin took a bite of the dessert with anticipation, and the moment it entered her mouth, her eyes widened in surprise. She put down her fork and stared at the plate in disbelief, thinking in shock how such a perfect brownie could exist in the world. She felt the rich chocolate flavor explode in her mouth, mixed with the light and wonderful touch of banana, its texture soft and melting in her mouth without leaving any sticky residue. Simply perfect. But Belle's reaction was unexpected. She looked at her with fear and pleading, telling her not to lie, and accusing Espin of merely flattering her to get her to accept the investment. Espin jumped up abruptly, angered by the accusation, and loudly reiterated that she was extremely strict about food and would never flatter when it came to taste, betting on her own name that it was the most delicious brownie she had ever had in her life. May looked at her friend in surprise, while Belle stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she had heard. Tears suddenly streamed from Belle's eyes, and she covered her mouth, muttering that she couldn't believe it. Belle confessed in a trembling voice that the only feedback she had ever received in her life was that what she made was the worst, which made Espin feel shocked and sympathetic toward her. Espin sat down to listen to Belle's painful story. The memory went back several years, to when Belle was an apprentice baker at a large dessert shop in the capital. But the head chef there, Pam, was an extremely cruel and sharp-tongued person. Pam often scolded Belle, accusing her of lacking creativity and talent, destroying her confidence with hurtful words, asking who would pay to eat what she made. Belle relied on her fiancé to get through those difficult times. He was her only safe harbor. She worked hard and diligently, hoping to bring good news to that kind man. But one day, her fiancé suddenly demanded to break off the engagement, telling her he had found someone else, and shockingly, his new girlfriend was none other than the head chef who tormented her, Pam. He didn't stop there, but said words that broke her heart more than the betrayal itself, coldly asking if she should just give up on making desserts and dealing her a fatal blow by saying that what she made was garbage compared to Pam's creations, which completely crushed her soul. In the present, Espin furiously slammed her fist on the table, screaming that the man was the real garbage for daring to say such things. Belle, with a sad smile, tried to calm the situation, saying that everyone's tastes are different and she was just glad Espin liked what she made. Espin told Belle not to give up on her dream because of someone like that, and assured her with confidence that her desserts would not only succeed in the capital, but would also shake the hearts of everyone in the entire empire. Belle looked at her hesitantly and in disbelief, unable to comprehend this level of confidence and praise. Espin decided to settle the matter and, with a sly smile, suddenly proposed a bet to them. She explained her plan to showcase May and Belle's desserts at the upcoming Apple Day Festival, betting that they could sell 100 servings of dessert. May was surprised by the sudden proposal and, after hearing Belle's story, wondered in amazement if Espin was serious. Espin set the terms of the bet, explaining that if they failed to sell more than 100 servings, she would stop visiting and offering to invest, no longer interfering in their affairs. Then she enthusiastically proposed her countercondition. If she won and they reached the sales target, they must agree to open a shop with her. She extended her hand to them, with a confident and brilliant smile, asking for their opinion on this fair proposal. Finally, Apology Day, or Apple Day, arrived, and May and Belle's stall was ready amidst the crowd. Espin pointed out that Apology Day is on the last day of every month, when people give each other small gifts to apologize, and small desserts and cute things are very common on this day. Espin, dressed in an elegant and charming outfit, stood in front of the stall, enthusiastically promoting boxes of colorful macarons shaped like cute animals, inviting everyone to try them, and confident that their cuteness would instantly melt the heart of anyone receiving an apology. Gasps of admiration and praise erupted from the crowd around the stall, drawn in by the cute macarons shaped like small animals, such as rabbits and frogs. As people scrambled to order and try the desserts immediately, the anxious looks on May and Belle's faces gradually faded, and Espin also enthusiastically joined in handling orders and distributing desserts to customers. Espin felt a huge sense of victory as her prediction came true perfectly. The desserts captured everyone's attention in an instant, causing sales to skyrocket just as she had said they would. May and Belle stood there, amazed by the overwhelming positive reaction, as words of praise for their desserts poured in from all directions, with people calling them the best they had ever had. Belle's cheeks turned red with shyness and excitement, unable to believe that people genuinely liked what she had made with her own hands, watching everything unfold with inner astonishment. Belle listened to the customers' comments. One lady suggested buying more, while a little girl confirmed the taste was very delicious, which planted a strong desire in Belle's heart to find courage and confidence. Deeply moved, Belle placed a hand on her chest and whispered to May that one serving wasn't enough because the taste was so wonderful. Finally, realizing her creations were not the garbage she had been told they were, May walked towards her friend, inviting more customers to come closer and try, while Belle became certain that there were truly people who appreciated and loved her baked goods. Billy and Espin watched the scene from nearby with satisfied smiles, happy for the two girls' success. Billy praised Espin's insight, admitting he was initially skeptical when she proposed the investment idea, whereas the business was indeed booming as she had predicted. Espin felt proud of herself, saying she was a good judge of character and knew these two would succeed, to which Billy agreed, describing her judgment as amazing. Now that victory was certain, Billy suggested leaving the rest to May and Belle and invited her to go look for gifts with him. Espin agreed. As they walked, Espin asked the guard, Billy, if he had anyone to apologize to on Apology Day. He replied that there were a few people, but he was sure she had far more people to apologize to than he did. Espin disagreed with his words, but he jokingly explained that more than one or two people had been caught up in the chaos she created. Espin then fell silent for a moment. Espin wandered through the market, looking for a suitable gift, thinking of buying something to eat or use, and glimpsed some beautiful flowers but shied away because they withered quickly. Espin wondered in confusion what kind of gifts people would choose with extreme care on a day like this. Billy asked for permission to go look around nearby. Billy's gaze fell on a stall selling colorful accessories. Billy approached the stall and picked up a few accessories, so Espin slyly asked if the gift was for a lady, since ladies would like such things. She curiously asked if the gift was for someone in the palace, but Billy denied it, explaining it was for the person he had caused trouble for at the bar last time. Espin then insisted he tell her what happened. Suddenly, Espin felt an immense pressure and a powerful aura approaching her, and she turned to see a person standing beside her. Seeing a young man with a burly physique, she wondered in her inner panic if a bear had come down from the mountains. Espin was surprised by his huge size, noticing he seemed even more burly than Billy, and wondered what kind of physique this was. She examined his face closely and found that he looked very young, perhaps only 3 or 4 years older than her, or maybe he was an adult with a baby face. This confused her. The young man noticed her gaze and turned his golden eyes towards her, causing Espin to panic and shyly turn her face away quickly. She scolded herself, as staring at people was considered rude, but she couldn't suppress her curiosity, her face turning red with shyness. She turned her gaze back to the table and discovered wish bracelets, reading the sign on them, which said that if the bracelet broke while being worn, the wish would come true. 2 bracelets caught her eye, one pink and the other brown. She thought it was just a superstition, but the colors reminded her of Luciano and herself. Espin enthusiastically decided to buy the bracelet and asked the seller for the price. The seller told her it was 5 fantasy coins each, so she asked him to wrap one up and that she would take the other one now, while Harrison stood beside her, observing the situation. Espin suddenly turned around with the bracelet and was surprised and confused to find Harrison standing right behind her, watching her. The female shopkeeper apologized to Harrison with regret, explaining that the bracelet was handmade and this was the only one, so Espin asked Harrison, who was standing beside her, if he had intended to buy it. Espin was surprised. When she learned that he also wanted to buy the bracelet, she told Harrison she intended to give it as an apology gift to a friend, but since he was also looking for an apology gift, she generously offered to let him buy it. Harrison suddenly stopped talking, his expression changed, and he stared ahead, while Espin noticed that his facial expression was somewhat familiar. Harrison stammered as he refused the offer and thanked her, but Espin noticed tears welling up in his eyes and, shocked, secretly wondered if he was crying. Espin, greatly alarmed, screamed and asked the reason for his sudden crying, afraid she had unintentionally done something wrong to him. Billy suddenly appeared, accusing her of making a stranger cry the moment she was out of his sight. Espin then screamed, vehemently denying it and defending herself. Billy placed a hand on his chest in pain and sorrow, while Espin tried to clarify the situation to Billy, saying she did nothing, and Billy apologized to the young man for hurting his feelings. Harrison quickly intervened to defend Espin, confirming to Billy that she had done nothing wrong. On the contrary, she was very kind and willing to give up something she wanted to buy. Espin tried to explain the situation to Billy, saying she didn't know the full tragic story and that the young man's sudden burst of tears made people misunderstand her, so Harrison apologized to her. Espin gazed at the young man's face, noticing his blonde hair and green eyes, and thought that for some reason he reminded her of Luciano, perhaps because of the hair color. Espin felt a strange sensation that prevented her from leaving him and simply walking away, as if a hidden bond was pulling her towards him. Espin, with sympathy and spontaneity, asked him if the apology he needed to make was so extremely difficult that it moved him so much. The young man looked at her silently, and then his eyes filled with tears again, which made Espin feel sorry and awkward for making him cry again. Billy quietly thought that they should step aside and leave the young man alone, while Espin tried to comfort him, telling him not to worry, reasoning that today was Apple Day, a day specifically for apologies. Espin gave a bright and hopeful smile, assuring the young man that if he apologized sincerely, the other person would surely forgive him. The young man looked at Espin, moved by her words. He muttered to himself in anguish, wondering if he could really be forgiven if he poured all his heart and feelings into an apology. He focused his gaze on Espin, doubting the possibility of such a thing happening in reality. In his heart, Harrison revealed his shocking truth, admitting that he was the son of the man who had pushed Luciano into hell, yet he still doubted if forgiveness was possible. After that, the events shifted, and, as Espin narrated, those days were unexpectedly filled with tears. She recalled the first scene where the man she met on Apple Day suddenly burst into tears in front of her. Then she remembered the second scene, the tears of joy shed by Belle and May after the great success of their desserts. Finally, Espin admitted that the last person to cry was herself. The scene shifted back to the palace, where Espin's mother was furiously and severely scolding her, reminding her that she had asked her to hold Billy's hand tightly when they were outside. As a result, she had gotten lost in the crowd, nearly triggering a missing child report. Espin remembered that when she was first reincarnated into this body, she was so captivated by the streets from a romantic fantasy novel that she wandered around curiously, slipping away from her parents, which made her mother become very strict about these things. Her mother scolded her harshly, asking if she realized how much of a shock they endured when Billy told them she was missing, and declared that she would not overlook this matter. Today, her mother delivered a harsh sentence, announcing that Espin was forbidden from going out for a month as punishment. Espin was greatly shocked, screaming in horror against the length of the punishment and begging her mother not to do it. But despite her desperate protests and pleas, her mother stood firm in her decision, and Espin had no choice but to be confined to the mansion for a whole month. Finally, the long month of punishment passed, and Espin returned to the palace for a visit. Espin, wearing an elegant red dress and a hat, wandered through the palace, searching everywhere for Prince Luciano, but there was no sign of him. Espin, carrying a surprise gift, muttered to herself anxiously because his room was empty, and she couldn't find him in his office either. Suddenly, a sharp and powerful voice came from behind a closed door, stopping her in her tracks, sternly asking who had given permission to enter here. Espin stood frozen, immediately realizing it was Luciano's voice. She realized the voice was coming from the reception room, and secretly hoped he didn't have a guest at the moment. Espin recalled a fact in her mind, that all who visited Luciano had ill intentions, and for him, there was no such thing as a welcome guest. She heard Luciano screaming inside, harshly scolding someone, asking when he had allowed him to bring this garbage, which confirmed Espin's suspicion that the guest was not welcome at all. She then hesitated about whether to go in, wondering if she should wait until their conversation was over. She placed her hand on the doorknob, thinking of another option, to intervene now and stand by Luciano's side, rescuing him from the situation. The door was suddenly pushed open, revealing Luciano screaming at his guest, ordering him to leave at once because he couldn't stand the sight of his face. But he was surprised by Espin's sudden entry. Espin tripped as she impulsively entered and fell to the floor, and Luciano looked at her in surprise. Espin felt extremely embarrassed sitting on the floor, realizing she had once again appeared at the worst possible moment. She quickly apologized while still on the ground, explaining that she wasn't eavesdropping but was worried that something untoward had happened to His Highness. Luciano coldly asked the guest why he was just standing there staring, telling him he had already opened the door so he could leave. Espin caught a glimpse of the other person and heard his voice, and a sense of familiarity with that tone filled her mind. Harrison stood there, holding a large gift box, and asked in a sad and broken voice where he should leave the gift. Espin immediately recognized him as the young man she had met at the market earlier and wondered in surprise why he was in the palace. Luciano cruelly replied that he didn't need such a trivial gift and ordered him to leave, pointing to the presence of another guest, Espin, saying he hadn't considered that. Harrison clutched the box tightly with his hand, while the prince asked if perhaps he should be the one to leave instead. However, the young man resolved the issue by deciding to leave, politely apologizing for his lack of taste, holding the rejected gift in his hands. Luciano extended a hand to help Espin up, ordering her to stand properly, while the young man left the room with his head bowed. Espin watched the young man's retreating back, secretly wondering about the identity of this nobleman who had the character to apologize to Luciano in such a manner. Suddenly, the truth flashed through her mind, and she gasped in shock as she realized his true identity. He was Luciano's cousin and the second male lead from the original novel. Espin connected the events, realizing that the similarity in their hair color was no coincidence. He was indeed Harrison. Harrison Olindo appeared in Espin's imagination as a noble knight. The text revealed that in the future, he would spend his life by Luciano's side as a loyal knight and master. But she also realized the reason for Luciano's current resolute and fierce rejection of him. Espin recalled the fact that Harrison was the son of the cousin who had attempted to poison Luciano when he was young, which explained the extreme hostility. Although Harrison was not directly involved in that heinous incident, every time Luciano faced Harrison, he was forced to remember that painful past, which made him unable to trust others, feeling suffocated and psychologically pained. Espin looked into Luciano's shadowed eyes and sadly realized that even if Harrison came to apologize on his father's behalf, it was not something Luciano could easily accept. Espin wondered in confusion about the reason for Harrison's early appearance, as according to the original story, he was supposed to appear several years later. She was even more surprised because no event had yet connected them, making his sudden appearance to apologize a puzzling and suspicious matter. Suddenly, Espin understood the word apology that Harrison had mentioned and remembered telling him on Apple Day not to worry, because that day was specifically for apologies. Espin was surprised to discover that it was her words that had encouraged him, remembering she had told him that a sincere apology would surely earn forgiveness from the other person. She covered her mouth in shock, realizing she was the reason for his early arrival and the change in the course of events. Espin felt terrified because she had caused a large part of the original story to be skipped. Harrison was supposed to hesitate much longer before gathering his courage, but her advice made him come very early, causing everything to happen quickly and suddenly. In her panic, she wondered how to fix this situation. Meanwhile, Espin apologized to Luciano in a trembling voice, and Luciano, looking at her in surprise, replied that he was the one who had been rude. Luciano remained silent, his expression still annoyed, so Espin decided on the best thing she could do now was to try to lighten the atmosphere. Espin smiled nervously and told him she had actually come to give him something, asking if she could present it to him now, hoping it would help mend their relationship. Luciano looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant, so Espin asked him to lend her his hand. Luciano hesitantly extended his hand, and Espin gently tied the wish bracelet onto his wrist. Espin enthusiastically explained to him that it was a wish bracelet, that he had to make a wish, and when the bracelet eventually broke, his wish would come true. She happily pointed out that it matched the one she was wearing. Luciano silently looked at the bracelet, noticing its color was like his eyes in Espin's view. Luciano thanked her in a faint voice, saying he liked it a lot. Espin felt relieved and happy that his mood had improved slightly and smiled brightly at him. She curiously asked Luciano what he would wish for, and he playfully replied that it was a secret no one could know. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and Espin wondered internally who could be visiting him this time. The atmosphere suddenly changed as Luciano received a sudden invitation from Queen Isabel, which sparked his concern and surprise. The queen invited him to a training match to be held the next day. Luciano and Espin arrived at the palace's training grounds, where the atmosphere seemed to be filled with tension. The queen greeted Luciano with a false smile, asking with subtle sarcasm if it was appropriate to summon him so suddenly when he was busy. Espin bowed respectfully, while the prince politely greeted the queen, and Luciano replied that the timing was fine. The queen feigned curiosity and asked about the reason for Espin's presence, to which Espin replied that she had just happened to be visiting the palace and wanted to pay her respects to Her Majesty the Queen, so she had accompanied him. The queen welcomed Espin coldly, while Espin whispered internally that Luciano had actually asked her not to come today. Espin wondered anxiously how she could let Luciano face the queen's unknown schemes alone. The queen explained the reason for summoning Luciano, saying there was something she wanted to ask for his help with. She pointed to her son, Stephen, saying he had been practicing swordsmanship recently and thought it would be good if Luciano could be his sparring partner. Luciano and Espin were shocked by this request. Luciano and Stephen exchanged sharp glances. Stephen held his sword with a provocative smile, while Luciano looked at him coldly. Espin realized Luciano was in a dangerous predicament. Due to his circumstances, he hadn't been able to learn swordsmanship since last year, which put him in extreme disadvantage against Stephen. The memory went back to last spring, specifically during the selection of swordsmanship instructors for the princes, when the Knight Commander offered to train Prince Stephen. In contrast, Luciano was coldly rejected and told he was not yet qualified to learn swordsmanship, leaving him to stand alone and isolated in the middle of the arena, with no knight willing to take him as a student. The queen was the one behind this decision, but now she feigned innocence and ignorance of the situation, asking Luciano to grant her request with a sly smile. Her request included an immediate training match with Stephen, and she had specifically gathered her followers to watch the spectacle, making it seem like a prearranged show. Espin clearly realized that the queen wanted to publicly humiliate Luciano in a fight whose outcome was already predetermined in favor of her well-trained son, and she was furious at this despicable act. Espin suddenly rushed between them, loudly protesting that it was unfair. The prince signaled for her to stop, while the queen looked at her coldly and arrogantly. Luciano silently shook his head at Espin, telling her to step back and not interfere, so she watched him with extreme anxiety. Luciano tried to explain his reasons for objecting to the queen, pointing out that he might not be a suitable opponent for Stephen, as it was well known that he had not received formal swordsmanship training. The queen laughed maliciously, mocking Luciano by saying she knew he sometimes swung a wooden sword by himself, sarcastically suggesting that perhaps he could learn something if he dueled with Stephen. Espin felt that her dignity and Luciano's had been severely insulted, unable to believe the queen would demand he learn from Stephen, who was younger than him. Luciano acted extremely calm, telling the queen that he would do his best if she insisted, while he helplessly closed his eyes in acceptance of the situation. The match began, and Luciano and Stephen stood face to face, each holding a wooden sword amidst the crowd's anticipation. The queen called Espin's name, covering half her face with a fan, and Espin answered cautiously. With a confident and cunning smile, the queen asked for her prediction on the match's outcome, as if she were certain of Luciano's inevitable defeat. Espin was silent for a moment. Then, with a confident voice and shining eyes, she declared with a defiant smile that she believed Prince Luciano was the one who would win. The queen's smile vanished, and she stared at Espin with a sharp, annoyed gaze at the unexpected answer. Deep down, Espin solidified her belief in Luciano's victory, clenching her hands tightly. She remembered that Luciano was the male lead of this novel, and even if he was currently ignored and trampled upon, his true colors as pure gold would eventually be revealed. Espin bet on his natural talent and his determination to win. As the battle between the brothers intensified, she anticipated that this combination might produce an outcome no one expected. Just as Stephen blocked a powerful blow from Luciano, the battle raged on, with a continuous sound of wooden swords clashing, as those present admired the fierce skill Prince Stephen displayed for his age. The queen watched the situation with hidden anxiety, while a spectator commented that Luciano's persistence was beyond expectations, as the two were now exchanging blows back and forth. The battle reached a fever pitch, with sparks flying, and a look of seriousness and concentration appeared on Luciano's face, while Stephen seemed surprised. Suddenly, Luciano delivered a swift blow that struck Stephen, causing him to cry out. The queen screamed Stephen's name in panic, while Espin gasped in surprise at the scene. The knights immediately intervened to stop the fight on the queen's command, while Stephen was shocked and bewildered by what had happened. Stephen hysterically roared in anger at the knights, ordering them not to come near him as the fight was not over. The knights recoiled in fear and hesitation before the young prince's fury, while Stephen glared at Luciano with a venomous look. Stephen touched his own face in disbelief, asking with overwhelming rage how Luciano dared to leave a mark on his face. Stephen drew his sword again and charged madly at Luciano. The force of the collision so great that Luciano's sword was knocked from his hand. Luciano's foot suddenly slipped, causing him to lose his balance at a critical moment. To the astonishment of the queen and Espin, Luciano fell heavily to the ground outside the ring. The referee immediately declared the match a victory for Prince Stephen, just as expected, using the opponent's fall to announce the result they wanted. From the very beginning, Stephen accepted congratulations with a victorious and arrogant smile, while Luciano remained where he was, trying to comprehend his humiliating defeat. While he was still on the ground, Espin, braving the stares of the crowd, rushed toward Luciano at lightning speed, while Stephen shot her a glance full of arrogance. Espin knelt beside Luciano, asking him eagerly and anxiously if he was hurt, to which he replied in a faint voice that he was fine, while Stephen watched them in surprise. The queen called for Stephen, and Stephen boasted about his victory, claiming he was completely fine and unaffected by the fight. But the queen grabbed him forcefully and scolded him, saying that if he had used his full strength from the beginning, Luciano would not have dared to touch him. She told him she was very disappointed in his performance. She whispered menacingly in his ear, reprimanding him, asking if he had prepared so much just to achieve such a meager victory, where he even let his opponent touch him. Stephen trembled in fear. Stephen apologized to his mother, while turning his head to see how worried Espin was for Luciano after his crushing defeat to Stephen that day. Luciano ran out of the training grounds at top speed, with Espin trying to catch up to him. Luciano continued to run alone until he completely disappeared from sight, leaving Espin panting behind. Espin stood there, both worried and confused, realizing how pain was squeezing his heart at that moment. She decided in her heart that she could not let him face this sorrow alone and insisted on finding him. She firmly told herself that friends do not abandon each other at times like this, and began her journey to find him. As Stephen silently watched her chase after Luciano, the queen scolded Stephen for standing there in a daze, telling him he would relearn the basics from scratch. As a form of punishment, Stephen appeared submissive, silently obeying the order with a look full of melancholy, ultimately resigning himself to his fate. Finally, Espin found Luciano's hiding place, and he flinched slightly upon hearing her call his name. She approached him with a warm smile, asking why he was sitting in a place like this. Luciano turned his face away from her, demanding in a trembling voice that she leave him alone, as he wanted to be by himself. Espin refused to leave, insisting on sitting beside him, saying she knew that, but couldn't leave him alone. She asked Luciano if he was upset about losing the match, and Luciano lowered his head affirmatively. In response to her question, she smiled at him sincerely, telling him she thought he was amazing today, fighting with both courage and skill. Luciano gripped his knees tightly, murmuring in pain and heartbreak, admitting that he still lost in the end, and pointing out that there was nothing amazing or impressive about it. Espin recalled in her mind that the match was unfair from the start, a fact Luciano was also aware of, and understood that this was why he felt such deep shame and anger. She thought sadly that if he had received proper training, or if he had been able to block Stephen's sword just one more time, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Luciano admitted in a faint, broken voice that he really wanted to win. Espin comforted Luciano with words of heartfelt sincerity, affirming that it was okay and expressing her complete confidence that he would definitely win next time. Luciano doubted Espin's words, thinking it was impossible to defeat Stephen because there was a limit to what one could learn on their own, meaning the skill gap between them would only widen over time. But Espin moved closer to him and passionately refuted this, affirming that she saw real talent in his swordsmanship. She promised him with a radiant smile, full of confidence, that she would do everything in her power to help him become stronger, reasoning that she would always be by his side. Luciano, moved by her sincere words, blushed slightly and whispered her name, then gently took her hand, expressing his deep gratitude. The next day, Espin wasted no time and went to the Adventurers Guild to submit an urgent request. Delia immediately handed her the required information sheet, which surprised Espin, who marveled at the speed with which things were handled. Espin thanked Delia, thinking to herself that given this amazing speed, the Adventurers Guild's information network was the real key to victory. Espin's comfort to Luciano was not just empty words to boost his morale, as she was certain that in the future he would grow to the level of a sword master, unmatched in swordsmanship, but only if he received proper education. Therefore, the person she was looking for this time was the man nicknamed Drunken Sword. He was the one who became Luciano's teacher in the original novel's plot. As the carriage passed through the forest, Espin wondered to herself why, despite knowing of his existence, she had only started looking for him now. Espin looked out the window, thinking that she was worried that by interfering with the characters' relationships and facilitating their early meeting, she might rob them of the opportunity to grow close and develop naturally. She recalled that Harrison's early appearance proved her worries were not unfounded, even though she didn't know his identity at the time. Espin sat in the carriage pondering the details of the original novel, which mentioned that Luciano and his teacher, Kyle, met by pure coincidence, and although she didn't know what they were doing at the time, she knew Luciano well. Her thoughts were interrupted by her guard, Billy, announcing their imminent arrival. She thought to herself that Luciano would not easily open up to strangers, and Espin smiled confidently, realizing that the second reason for her hesitation was Luciano's cautious nature. But now she understood what to do. Because even after becoming friends, Luciano remained wary of people, so she needed a legitimate and strong reason to introduce someone to him. Espin stepped out of the carriage, thinking that the recent experience of failure and humiliation would make Luciano strongly desire a great teacher. Now was the perfect time to find the Drunken Sword. The two stood in front of a bar called Dead Drunk. Billy's face showed obvious anxiety as he asked if she really intended to go inside. Espin answered with full confidence that according to Delia's intelligence, the person she was there to see was inside. Billy muttered in fear, imagining the punishment he would receive if the Earl found out he had brought his daughter to such a place. But Espin comforted him in an uncertain tone, urging him to go inside. Billy, his face covered in sweat, demanded a promise. If he judged the situation inside to be unsuitable, they must leave immediately. Espin agreed with an innocent smile, but in return, she proposed that if one of the drunks attacked her, he must protect her. Billy was stunned by her strange condition, while she had already run towards the entrance, leaving him with a confused look on his face. Billy tried to catch up to her, frantically shouting questions about the attack story and what on earth she was planning. Espin forcefully pushed open the bar door and walked in, waving and shouting a loud greeting, announcing she was there to see the Drunken Sword, while Billy's attempts to stop her were in vain. The bar suddenly fell into a dead silence, all eyes turning to the little girl, while a man with blue hair and an eye patch was chugging beer before slamming his mug down on the table. The man turned to her with a sharp gaze and an annoyed expression, calling her a brat and threateningly asking who dared to call him by that name so recklessly. The man confronted Espin with a threatening tone, calling her a little squirt for daring to use his title. Espin boldly asked if he was the drunkard Cal, to which he replied indifferently and provocatively, asking what if he was. She told him she wanted to talk to him. He coldly turned his face away, declaring he had nothing to say to a noble lady. Espin, annoyed at being completely ignored, decided to throw out a more interesting topic to get his attention. She suddenly called out his real name, Cal Pedro, confirming he was the one, which made his expression freeze, with obvious shock showing in his single eye. His face turned angry and shocked, and he asked in a grim and terrifying tone how a noble girl could know this forgotten name. Espin noticed that as soon as she uttered his real name, the entire atmosphere changed completely. She suddenly felt a sense of danger. His hand shot out towards her with lightning speed, and Espin screamed in panic, stammering as she tried to back away. He almost grabbed her if not for Billy's swift intervention, blocking his hand and shielding Espin with his body, while Kyle was surprised by this reaction speed. The two men exchanged sharp, tense glances, while Espin trembled behind Billy. Espin realized the attack was so sudden she hadn't even thought to dodge, and if Billy hadn't grabbed her at the critical moment, Kyle would have surely grabbed her by the collar. Kyle praised Billy's quick reflexes, but issued a stern warning to Espin not to underestimate and look down on him, just because he was a drunkard or she would get hurt. Kyle continued to speak angrily, thinking they had sent a child to lower his guard, asking if those people had no dignity, which surprised Espin, who didn't understand who he was talking about. Meanwhile, the bar's patrons stood up from their seats with frowns, asking if another noble had come to harass Cal. The crowd began to murmur angrily, recalling how Kyle had taught the last person who came for him a lesson, and Espin realized there were hostile noble factions targeting Kyle, and the bar's patrons were trying to protect him. Espin clenched her dress tightly, realizing she needed to clear up this misunderstanding immediately before things got out of hand and everyone turned against her. Espin screamed in a loud and powerful voice, asking them to wait and confirming that they had completely misunderstood the situation. Kyle was surprised by her scream while she boldly pointed a finger at him in accusation. She sharply explained that she had clearly said she only wanted to talk, with no intention of attacking, and confirmed that he was the one who started threatening her first. Suddenly, she turned to the surrounding crowd and scolded them, asking if it was right for a group of adults to gang up on and threaten a lone child without even hearing an explanation, even if it was to help a friend. The men, embarrassed and confused by her logical words, began to ask each other if they were the bad guys in this situation, especially since she hadn't brought any soldiers. Kyle looked at her suspiciously, admitting that his old name was only known to those who knew his past, and asked if she was using it as a threat, implying she had leverage over him. Espin looked at him and Billy, thinking to herself that the student was indeed exactly like the teacher, both extremely cautious and difficult to deal with. Espin tried to defend her position, telling him to think logically, that if she had malicious intent, she wouldn't have appeared before him in such a direct manner. She honestly admitted to having looked for him and gathered information on him, but only because she wanted to ask him for a favor and propose a deal if he was unwilling to help. Kyle laughed sarcastically, mocking the idea of a little girl wanting to make a deal with him. But Espin smiled confidently and energetically, confirming she was no ordinary child, asking him to hear her out as he wouldn't regret it, and suggested they move to another place to talk freely. Kyle agreed, and they moved to a quieter, brighter outdoor location. Kyle seriously asked what favor she wanted to ask of him, stating in advance that he wouldn't guarantee he'd agree. Espin cut straight to the point with a confident smile, pointing out that the rumors she heard confirmed his swordsmanship was exceptional, paving the way for her main request. Espin seriously asked the man if he had ever considered taking on a disciple. Kyle was surprised by her question, thinking she wanted to learn herself, but she corrected him, explaining that she wanted him to train a friend of hers. She enthusiastically assured him that her friend had immense potential and would become an exceptional swordsman with a good teacher. She offered him a tempting deal. If he accepted her proposal, in return, she would help him achieve his wish. Kyle looked at her with suspicion and mockery, wondering if she even knew what he wanted, to which she replied with full confidence. Then she dropped the bombshell on him, revealing the truth of what he was after, directly asking if what he sought was revenge. Kyle's gaze turned extremely wary as he asked just how much she had dug into his background. Espin, with a feigned innocent smile, pointed out that knowing the name Kyle, Pedro meant she knew everything. But deep down, she knew she was partly bluffing and half-guessing. Espin recalled the information from the novel, which mentioned he was once an Imperial Knight who was dishonorably discharged due to a certain incident. She remembered that in the original story, he trained Luciano only to use him for his revenge. Espin connected his aversion to nobles with his drastic reaction to hearing his real name, deducing that his target was the person who framed him and caused his dismissal from the knighthood. Since the responsibility for any incident within the knighthood falls on the captain, and the current captain is loyal to Queen Isabel, Espin cleverly realized they had a common enemy and offered to help him get revenge on the Queen's faction. She asked for his thoughts on the proposal. While looking at him with a provocative gaze, Kyle admitted her proposal was bold and that she was indeed not someone to be underestimated. But he added that even if she knew his target, the help she could offer was limited. Kyle made his own proposal, demanding that she bring the boy she wanted him to train so he could judge for himself whether the boy was worth the trouble before making a decision. Espin noticed his cunning smile, realizing he planned to claim Luciano had no talent as soon as he saw him. thus sending them away. She smiled with sarcastic confidence in her heart, thinking what a shame that was, because she was certain that Luciano was a genius destined to become the strongest in this world. She enthusiastically accepted the challenge, warning him to be prepared to be amazed. She felt incredibly excited in anticipation of the fateful meeting between the teacher and the student. The next day, Luciano came to the tavern, looking very reluctant at Espin's insistence. Luciano looked at Kyle with disgust, calling him an old man, but Espin was surprised after Luciano spoke so rudely. Espin felt extremely nervous, internally hoping Luciano would watch his words, after all the effort she put into arranging this meeting. But the atmosphere grew tense, and the conversation broke off immediately as they faced each other. Luciano, being extremely blunt and rude, asked Espin who this man reeking of alcohol was, refusing to believe this drunkard was the person she wanted to introduce him to, while Espin frantically tried to shut him up. Kyle sarcastically commented that he hadn't expected another rude child, pointing out that Luciano spoke to strangers without any courtesy. Espin was terrified seeing them clash from the very first moment, realizing that if this continued, it would lead to an explosion between these two strong personalities. Espin remembered that she couldn't reveal Luciano's identity as a prince right now and tried to salvage the situation before Luciano said something that would expose him. Espin thought that if Kyle knew Luciano was a prince, he might immediately accept him as the perfect tool for revenge, which would make it impossible and much more difficult for them to build genuine trust. She decided she needed to create a moment for them to accept each other naturally, setting aside titles and interests. Espin called out Luciano's nickname, Lucy, in a loud and affectionate voice, asking him to listen to her and reminding him that his birthday was coming up and she had something special for him. Luciano froze in surprise, and Espin wondered inwardly if shortening his name had angered him. But she noticed his tense expression, the twitching corner of his eye, and the movement of his mouth. She understood that Luciano was trying to hide something, and although he was blushing from shyness and trying not to show it, he seemed to accept the name Lucy. Espin thought that Luciano seemed to like the nickname Lucy because it sounded friendly and wondered if he would accept her gift in this situation. She enthusiastically continued her act, confirming that Lucy was perfect while signaling with her eyes for him to accept the gift. Luciano stammered and shyly agreed. Kyle watched this scene with mockery, wondering in surprise if he was just a prop in their play, and sarcastically commented that they were having fun. He announced with boredom that he was leaving if they were going to play house in front of him. But Espin quickly stopped him, asking him not to get excited and to at least exchange greetings. Espin formally introduced Kyle to Luciano, announcing with a radiant smile that he was the one who would become his teacher. Luciano looked at her, shocked and surprised, asking what she meant by teacher. Espin assured him that he would be a swordsmanship teacher who would teach him the proper techniques of the sword. Luciano thanked her for the thought, but rejected the offer with cold politeness and a sharp gaze. He pointed at Kyle and sharply explained that he didn't want to learn swordsmanship from someone who couldn't even take care of himself, who didn't carry a well-maintained sword, and instead reeked of alcohol. A fire ignited in Kyle's eyes, and he called Luciano an arrogant child, asking if he knew how great and powerful he used to be. He approached him provocatively, demanding that he test him, and vowing to break that arrogance of his for good. Luciano again coldly refused the offer, saying he didn't see the need. Kyle sarcastically asked him if he was scared of a real fight now that things were getting serious, or if he didn't trust the judgment of the friend who brought him. Luciano wondered what he planned to do to a child, and if he wouldn't be the one embarrassed if they fought. Kyle declared with excessive confidence that he would bet his life on winning, confirming that Luciano wouldn't even be able to scratch him. Kyle held up a finger to specify the condition. It was just one hit, one round of barehanded fighting, and Luciano could use any move he wanted. If he could knock him down or even touch him, it would be his win. Luciano was stunned by this excessive confidence, questioning its source and marveling at the arrogance. Kyle coldly replied that strength was the source, and that he had given him a huge advantage, so he shouldn't back down like a coward. Luciano finally accepted the challenge with a sharp gaze, warning him not to regret this choice. Espin watched the situation nervously, wondering inwardly if Kyle was deliberately provoking Luciano to drag him into this fight, and decided to cheer for Kyle in her heart, for him to take control and prove his worth. Luciano charged at his opponent with speed and surprise, shouting excitedly, But Kyle dodged the attack with a very simple and smooth movement, as if he had completely anticipated its path, and scoffed contemptuously. Espin was stunned by the scene, as Kyle had managed to break Luciano's balance in an instant with minimal effort. Luciano tried to regain his balance and launched another attack with a series of rapid punches. However, Kyle dodged with a confident smile, evading every blow with a skill that infuriated the young prince. Suddenly, Kyle grabbed Luciano's hand to stop him, offering him advice in the tone of a stern teacher, praising his attempt but warning him that if he attacked recklessly with a broken stance, he could easily be countered. Luciano was shocked, his eyes wide with disbelief, as he was sure his attack had been perfectly aimed at his opponent's blind spot. Kyle replied with a cunning smile, explaining that this was the gap that experience brings, and provocatively asked if he had given up already. Luciano, not giving up, continued to challenge Kyle, attacking him again and again. But the result was the same. Kyle easily deflected and blocked all of Luciano's attacks, as if playing with a child. Luciano attempted to deliver a powerful kick. Kyle blocked it with his arm without moving an inch, while a look of exhaustion and astonishment appeared on Luciano's face. Kyle looked at him with a gaze mixed with pity and challenge, asking if that was his strongest blow. Kyle quickly pushed Luciano away with his hand, commenting with boredom that the fight had become very tedious. Luciano staggered and nearly fell, so Espin rushed to him anxiously, asking if he was okay. Luciano was panting heavily, drenched in sweat, as he looked at Kyle in shock, marveling at who this man was. Kyle stood tall, asking in a victor's tone if Luciano admitted defeat based on how he was speaking now. Luciano wiped the sweat from his face and admitted with bitterness and courage that Kyle was far superior to anyone he had ever faced before. Hearing this, Espin's face lit up as Luciano's attitude had become more polite and he acknowledged his opponent's strength, which she saw as a golden opportunity to connect them as master and disciple. Espin seized the opportunity to formally introduce Kyle this time, turning to Luciano enthusiastically to explain that she would reintroduce him properly, and confirmed his identity as Kyle Pedro. She pointed at him and proudly added that although he was now a drunkard in a bar, he possessed skills worthy of serving in the Imperial Knights. Upon hearing the name, Luciano froze in place, repeating the name Kyle Pedro under his breath, as if recalling a distant memory. Luciano immediately remembered that this was the name of the former captain of the Knights. Luciano retrieved from his memory an image of Kyle in a knight's uniform, a man who, despite his commoner origins, had seized the position of the youngest captain of the Knights through sheer skill. He remembered how he was hailed as a genius swordsman and the immense trust he enjoyed not only within the knighthood, but also among the populace. Luciano looked at the Kyle before him in astonishment, recalling the rumor that the captain of the Knights had been suddenly replaced 5 years ago, thinking he was too young at the time to realize his achievements, but he never imagined a giant like him would end up in a back alley. Meanwhile, Espin herself was in a state of internal shock, sweating as she thought to herself that she had no idea the old drunkard was such an amazing figure, as her information was superficial. Kyle noticed Luciano's surprised expression and replied arrogantly that he didn't expect a rude child like him to know who he was. This immediately provoked Luciano's anger, as he had never accepted being described as a rude child. Espin, with a very nervous smile, quickly intervened to calm the situation before Kyle made another mistake of insulting the prince, trying to save the situation. Espin introduced Luciano to Kyle, clearly and calmly announcing that His Highness the Prince's name was Luciano Frederick. Upon hearing the name, Kyle's expression instantly froze, and he repeated the surname Frederick in a tone of disbelief. His eyes widened in shock and cold sweat began to form on his forehead, as he immediately realized that the name Frederick could only be held by members of the royal family. Kyle did not hesitate to fall to his knees, bowing his head in extreme reverence, and apologized in a trembling voice for his previous rudeness, explaining that he was unaware because he had left the palace when the prince was still very young. Kyle continued to apologize sincerely, begging the prince to forgive his unintentional offense. But Luciano quietly extended a hand to Kyle, asking him to rise, and mentioned that this would count as their first official meeting, then added with a faint smile, reminding Kyle that he had now become his teacher. And so, the tense meeting between Luciano and Kyle ended on a warm note, as the two shook hands and accepted each other opening their hearts to a new relationship. Luciano immediately threw himself into serious training, enthusiastically beginning his wooden sword practice under the supervision of his new teacher. Meanwhile, Espin wasted no time and followed up on the additional investment with May and Belle. She bought a shop, preparing to make it the main branch of the Mabel dessert shop in preparation for the grand opening. Espin worked with May, meticulously selecting the location and facilities. They did this on their own to prepare a special surprise for Belle. Espin looked at her piggy bank, tears welling up in her eyes, heartbroken over the huge sum of money that had disappeared from her savings for this investment. But she comforted herself that she would surely get a tenfold return in the future. May expressed her deep gratitude to Espin, promising that they would do their best to make the project a success. Espin curiously asked about the dessert they had prepared for the Apple Festival, and May enthusiastically told her that they had brought some pies for her to taste. May brought out a delicious blueberry pie, and Espin took a bite, hearing a crisp and pleasant crunch. Espin praised the excellent taste, and May confidently assured her that they were able to sell out all their stock every day, which meant business was going very well. On the day of the Apple Festival, Espin was walking down the street, eating a pie, while Harrison appeared in the background, carrying a pile of gifts. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to Espin, and she turned to see who was calling her. Harrison was standing there, holding a large pile of gifts, and gently asked if she was well, mentioning that it had been a month since he had last seen her. Espin recognized him immediately, smiling and cheering his name, Harrison. But she noticed something strange. Harrison looked extremely tired and pale, and he was holding many gifts. In a faint voice, she asked Harrison if he had also visited His Highness Prince Luciano today. Harrison gave an affirmative answer. Her expression grew worried, and she asked if the prince had rejected him again. Harrison, recalling the moment of rejection, sadly gave an affirmative reply. Espin began to worry about him greatly, while pondering the reason for her anxiety, wondering if it was because she had seen him being thrown out of the reception room that day. Espin started to fall into gloomy thoughts, believing that Harrison had come to apologize so soon because of her and the mistakes she had made in the past. Espin broke off her train of thought and gently asked if they could talk for a moment, if he had the time. They sat together at an outdoor table, and Harrison began by apologizing for what had happened last time. Espin understood he was referring to the day she met him, when he had come to apologize to Luciano. Espin tried to reassure him, saying there was no need to apologize, but he justified his apology, thinking that perhaps he had made her feel uncomfortable. Espin quickly denied this, confirming that she was more worried about him. Then Harrison looked at her seriously, realizing that she had discovered his true identity as Lord Olindo. In a polite and hesitant tone, Harrison asked Espin, noting that she seemed to be very close to His Highness the Prince, and inquired how long it took her to gain the prince's trust, if the question wasn't too intrusive. Espin observed him and thought to herself, noting that Harrison's desire to apologize to Luciano seemed very sincere, even though this was only his second visit. With a hint of sadness, she answered him honestly, saying that it took her a little over a year, and felt sympathy for him, as she knew that everything Luciano had been through would take more than just time to heal. Harrison's eyes widened in surprise, and he repeated in shock, "A whole year?" Espin affirmed her words, explaining that ever since she first met him at the age of 8, she had been following and chasing after him everywhere. She admitted to him that, at first, she had heard many cruel and hurtful words from him, and recalled the times when her attempts to help only ended up angering the prince and making him even more irritated. Harrison asked her in amazement if she really hadn't given up for a whole year. Espin replied confidently that if she had given up, the prince would have been all alone again, pointing out that people approaching him only to back away would just make the walls he built around his heart even thicker. She explained to him that her greatest motivation was wanting him to know that at least one person was on his side. She added with a warm smile that she believed at some point the prince began to realize her true intentions and understand her. Harrison muttered the word sincerity to himself, as if pondering its meaning. Then his tone turned sorrowful as he explained that his situation was a bit different because he had actually committed a crime against the prince. He looked at her with sad eyes and asked if she was prepared to hear a topic that might be heavy and painful. He began to tell his story, explaining that when he was younger than he was now, he had contracted an extremely dangerous illness. Doctors, priests, and even mages had examined him, but their answer was always the same. There was no cure. He continued, saying that just as he was losing all hope, his father received an offer from someone. It was a devilish proposal. If his father poisoned Prince Luciano, they would give him a potion that could save his son's life. Although his father knew it was a grave mistake and that he shouldn't do it, he wavered in the face of his desire to save his son. Espin realized the cruel truth. Count Olindo had chosen to save his own son instead of his nephew. Harrison clenched his fists, tears in his eyes, and admitted that it was ultimately all his fault that the prince couldn't trust others and had built walls around his heart. Espin looked at him sympathetically as Harrison continued, saying that he knew he couldn't atone for his father's sin, but he just wanted to apologize to the prince with all his heart. Tears streamed from his eyes as he asked her, with weakness and hope, if she believed his sincerity could one day reach Luciano. Espin immediately and firmly replied that it definitely would. She handed Harrison a handkerchief to wipe his tears, while Espin thought to herself that this was a role she could play because she knew the plot of the original novel. Because she was certain that Harrison would eventually become Luciano's closest knight and his loyal guardian. Espin decided to offer him advice, saying that he must remember that an apology has to take the recipient's feelings into account. She seriously advised him not to offer any food, as the prince had a trauma from being poisoned, and to make it absolutely clear that he meant no threat. She also suggested he give the prince time to think, as his appearance had been too sudden. Harrison expressed his deep gratitude to her for the advice she had given him. Suddenly, Espin felt a gloomy presence behind her, and a voice called out, "My little lady." She turned around in alarm and found Billy standing beside her. Billy looked both angry and worried, chiding her that he had been looking for her everywhere, only to be surprised to find her having tea with a complete stranger. Billy looked at Harrison suspiciously, while Espin reminded him that this was the person they had caught a glimpse of on the day of the apology. Despite realizing his question was rude, Billy directly asked Harrison his age, which confused the young man. Billy didn't wait long before flying into a rage, loudly stressing that his little lady was only 11 years old and scolding that any sane adult should know better than to approach a child. Espin panicked and tried to stop him, shouting his name. Harrison, blushing with shame and confusion, rushed to clear up the huge misunderstanding, revealing that he had just turned 16 this year, which shocked both Billy and Espin, and were in complete disbelief. Billy stared at him suspiciously and asked if he was really 16, which Harrison seriously confirmed. Billy sighed and apologized for his misunderstanding, and Harrison graciously accepted the apology, explaining that his tall build often led people to that misconception. Despite the apology, Billy maintained his stern stance, declaring that he absolutely refused to allow secret dates at such a young age, even if the Earl didn't know. This made Espin inwardly wonder in frustration why he had to act this way today, of all days. Billy continued his embarrassing interrogation, sharply asking Harrison if he had any improper intentions toward the young lady, which Harrison nervously and vehemently denied. Billy pointed at the huge pile of gifts, suspiciously deducing that they surely weren't for his little lady. Espin couldn't take it anymore. She yelled in Billy's face for him to stop and loudly confirmed that their relationship was not at all what he thought. To completely dispel his doubts and end Billy's interrogation, she was forced to tell a cruel and direct lie, publicly announcing that Harrison was not her type at all, while inwardly apologizing to him, knowing it was the only way to make Billy shut up. Harrison was shocked by her words, looking both dejected and hurt, while Espin coldly confirmed to Billy that her preferences were very clear. Espin dragged Billy away, apologizing to Lord Olindo for her rudeness and telling him she had to leave now, giving Billy a silent warning that she was watching him before she left. Espin turned to Harrison and wished him well with the matter that was worrying him. Harrison gratefully placed a hand on his chest, sincerely thanking her for everything she had done that day and for the advice he would never forget, and wished her a safe journey home. Harrison stood in place watching her leave, murmuring Miss Samuel's name with a look full of gratitude.